The twin moons of Zephros cast a pale, golden light across the desert plain, their glow refracting through the thin atmosphere and painting the sands with an eerie, iridescent hue. Mila Enerith adjusted the filtration mask on her face, her breaths measured as she scanned the horizon with a pair of compact field binoculars. The landscape was alive with motion, though no life stirred visibly. Only the winds, constant and unyielding, carrying fine grains of sand that whispered secrets of the planet's untold history. She had arrived on Zephros 3 days ago, sent under orders from her faction to study the peculiar ecosystem and, unofficially, to verify rumors of an unmined resource that rivaled spice in its potential. The Benevolent, the ecologist offshoot faction Mila served, had no illusions about the stakes. If the rumors were true, Zephros wouldn't remain an isolated frontier for long. The stars above already held the greed of countless powers waiting to descend. Behind her, the sturdy dome of her field station hummed faintly, its generators working to maintain a livable atmosphere in the planet's caustic environment. Mila's fingers hovered briefly over the binocular controls, tuning into a faint distortion far ahead. She froze. A shimmering anomaly danced across the horizon, like heat waves over sand, though the air was cool. It was the same phenomenon she had spotted the previous evening, just before the winds had risen and forced her indoors. The anomaly lingered, taunting her with its refusal to remain steady, before fading into nothing. "Zephros is watching me," Mila muttered under her breath, a quiet mantra she'd adopted to ground herself amid the planet's silent hostility. Her fingers tightened around the binoculars. Whether it was watching her with indifference or malice remained to be seen. The station door hissed open, and the sound of boots crunching against the sand pulled her from her thoughts. She turned to see Kane Varnon, his tall frame silhouetted against the harsh artificial light spilling from the doorway. He moved with an ease that belied the planet's hostility, his dark cloak billowing slightly in the wind. Kane was a contractor, officially hired to oversee her safety on Zephros, unofficially to ensure her findings remained secure and uncompromised. His presence was a comfort Mila didn't want to admit to herself, though his sharp gaze and quick tongue made him difficult to read. "Anything interesting?" he asked, his voice smooth but edged with perpetual suspicion. Mila lowered the binoculars, turning fully to face him. "An anomaly," she said simply, gesturing toward the horizon. "Same spot as last night. It's either the planet's atmosphere playing tricks on me, or there's something out there worth finding." Kane stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as he peered into the distance. "Zephros doesn't play tricks," he said quietly. "If you're seeing something, it's because the planet wants you to see it." Mila frowned, uncertain whether to take his words as wisdom or mysticism. Kane had been on Zephros far longer than her, and though he rarely spoke of his past, he carried an intimacy with the planet that bordered on reverence. "And what does the planet want?" she asked, her tone light but probing. Kane's piercing eyes flicked to hers, his expression unreadable. "That depends," he said after a moment, his voice low, "on whether it sees you as part of its balance or as something to be removed." The wind howled softly and Mila suppressed a shiver. Zephros was alive, in ways she had yet to understand. The interior of the field station was a stark contrast to the alien beauty outside, its sterile walls illuminated by the bluish glow of monitors that hummed faintly with streams of data. Mila pulled off her mask and hung it on the wall beside the decontamination unit. her gaze lingering briefly on the faint dusting of Zephros' sand clinging to its surface. The sand was finer than any she'd encountered on other worlds, almost powder-like, and its presence felt intrusive, finding its way into even the most secure equipment. It was as if the planet itself refused to be kept out. Moving toward her workstation, Mila keyed in the anomaly's readings from the previous night, her fingers hovering over the controls as she brought up the irregular spikes in thermal activity and electromagnetic interference. The data wasn't much, an erratic pulse that appeared for less than a minute before disappearing entirely, but it was enough to ignite her curiosity. On Zephros, every fluctuation, no matter how small, held the promise of something extraordinary or dangerous. Kane leaned casually against the doorframe, his eyes darting across the room with a detachment that Mila found both comforting and unnerving. His dark cloak, still speckled with sand, gave him an air of rugged authority. "This place is quiet," he said, his voice breaking the hum of the monitors. "Too quiet for what you're chasing." Mila glanced at him over her shoulder, one eyebrow raised. "What's that supposed to mean?" she asked, her tone skeptical. Kane tilted his head slightly, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I mean, you're not the first person to come looking for something out here, and the ones who came before you, well, let's just say they didn't leave much behind." Mila turned fully to face him, crossing her arms. "And you're just telling me this now?" she demanded, irritation creeping into her voice. Kane shrugged, the movement casual, but his eyes betrayed a sharpness that never left him. "You didn't ask," he replied simply. His gaze drifted to one of the monitors where a faint overlay of the anomaly's data still blinked. "Look," he continued, his tone softening slightly. "Zephros has a way of hiding its secrets until it decides you're ready, or until it decides to swallow you whole. I'm here to make sure you don't end up as another piece of its landscape." Mila bristled at his cryptic tone. "You're full of riddles, Kane," she muttered, turning back to her workstation. "If you've got something useful to say, now's the time." Her fingers moved deftly over the controls, adjusting parameters and cross-referencing the anomaly's data with past atmospheric readings. The more she delved into the details, the less certain she felt about what she was seeing. The spikes didn't align with any known natural phenomena, nor did they resemble the signatures of human-made equipment. Whatever was out there, it defied easy categorization, a fact that both thrilled and unsettled her. Kane stepped closer, his boots making barely a sound on the metal floor. Mila could feel the weight of his presence behind her, an unspoken challenge in the way he moved. "Your anomaly," he said, gesturing to the screen. "It's not random. Zephros doesn't do random." Mila sighed, running a hand through her hair. "Then what is it?" she asked, her tone edged with exasperation. Kane's eyes met hers, his gaze steady and unflinching. "A breadcrumb," he said, simply. "The question is whether you're willing to follow it." Mila turned back to the screen, her frustration mounting. She wasn't new to fieldwork, and cryptic warnings weren't going to deter her. "Breadcrumbs are great," she said, her voice sharp. "If you're not walking straight into a trap." Kane chuckled softly, the sound low and dry. He replied, "It tests you, and if you're seeing something, it's because the planet wants you to see it. But that doesn't mean it's safe." Mila frowned, her fingers pausing over the controls. The weight of his words settled over Mila like a heavy blanket, and for a moment, the glow of the monitors seemed blinding. She glanced back at him, searching his face for answers, but Kane's features remained inscrutable. "You talk about this place like it's alive," she said finally. Kane nodded, his gaze drifting toward the viewport where the faint shimmer of the horizon anomaly could still be seen. "Because it is," he said. "Not like a person, but like something greater. The winds, the sands, the way it hides and reveals. It's all part of a system, a delicate balance. You disrupt that, then you'll know." Mila leaned against the edge of her workstation, her arms crossed tightly as she tried to process his words. She'd read about Zephros before accepting this mission, the strange reports, the legends whispered by those few who had ventured here and returned. But experiencing it firsthand was something else entirely. The planet felt alive in a way no textbook could describe, and the thought of it watching her, testing her, sent a chill down her spine. "If the planet's testing me," she said, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach, "then I'll pass. But I'm not here to play its games. I'm here to figure out what's out there and why it's drawing me in." Kane stepped closer, his presence looming but not unwelcome. "Just remember," he said softly, his tone almost gentle, "the planet's patience isn't infinite. It'll give you what you're looking for, but only if you're ready to pay its price." Mila met his gaze, her determination unshaken. "I didn't come here to fail," she said firmly. "Whatever the price is, I'll handle it." Kane's lips twitched into a faint smile, but there was no humor in his eyes. "I hope you're right," he said, turning toward the door, "because on Zephros there aren't second chances." Mila stood motionless as the station door sealed behind Kane, its hiss blending with the faint hum of the air recyclers. She stared at the anomaly data on her screen, her mind turning over his words like a stone in her hand. Zephros doesn't do random. It was a riddle she couldn't ignore. Whatever this planet was, whatever it was hiding, it had drawn her here with purpose, and she intended to uncover it, even if the path was treacherous. Adjusting the workstation's interface, she magnified the anomaly readings, isolating its electromagnetic signature. The pulse was faint but consistent, a repeating pattern like a heartbeat or a signal. "It's calling," she murmured to herself, a mix of awe and unease tightening her chest. The thought that something out there, natural or otherwise, was actively reaching out sent a shiver down her spine. The readings were incomplete. She needed more data. Mila tapped into the external sensors scattered around the station's perimeter, adjusting their range to focus on the anomaly's origin point. A low beep indicated a return, and the readings filled her brain with patterns of thermal distortion and faint fluctuations in atmospheric density. The anomaly wasn't stationary, it was moving. "Kane," she called, her voice cutting through the silence. The door hissed open and Kane reappeared, his expression sharp. "What is it?" he asked, his tone cautious. Mila pointed to the screen. "The anomaly, it's shifting. It's not a fixed phenomenon. Whatever it is, it's alive or controlled." Kane moved closer, his gaze narrowing as he studied the data. "That's not the wind," he said quietly, his voice losing its earlier sarcasm. His brow furrowed as he straightened, his body tense. "If it's moving, it's tracking something. Or someone." Mila's stomach twisted. "You mean us?" she said, her voice flat. Kane nodded, his eyes meeting hers. "Possibly. Or someone else out there, and they're drawing it in." He reached for his communicator, a compact device clipped to his belt. "We need to know what we're walking into before we head out." Mila resisted the urge to argue. Her instincts screamed to act now, to follow the anomaly before it disappeared. But Kane's caution was undeniable. Zephros was dangerous, and rash decisions could mean death. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that waiting was a mistake, that the planet was testing her resolve, daring her to confront its secrets. "What do you suggest?" she asked, forcing calm into her voice. Kane's eyes flicked to the viewport, where the shimmer of the anomaly was faint but visible on the horizon. "We gear up," he said firmly, "and we move fast. If there's something, or someone, out there, we can't afford to let them get ahead of us." The next 20 minutes passed in a blur of frenzied preparation. Mila packed her field bag with essential equipment: thermal scanners, a small portable drone, and a data slate loaded with environmental analysis tools. She clipped her filtration mask securely to her belt and adjusted her lightweight exosuit, its thin polymer layers designed to withstand Zephros' abrasive winds while allowing for mobility. Kane moved with practiced efficiency, checking the seals on his own gear and inspecting his rifle and another compact weapon he rarely carried, but now held with quiet intent. The sight of it sent a ripple of unease through Mila. "Expecting trouble?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. Kane didn't look up. "On Zephros?" he said dryly. "Always." The two stepped out of the station into the relentless wind, their masks shielding them from the planet's abrasive atmosphere. The horizon shimmered with the faint outline of the anomaly, its movement slow but deliberate, like a predator stalking unseen prey. Mila adjusted the settings on her scanner, the device emitting a soft hum as it calibrated to the anomaly's unique signature. "It's moving northwest," she said, her voice muffled by the mask. Kane nodded, his eyes scanning the horizon as he adjusted the grip on his weapon. "Then so are we," he said. Without another word, they began their trek across the dunes, their steps crunching against the sand that shifted beneath them like liquid. The landscape was eerily quiet, the only sound the steady rush of the wind and the faint whir of Mila's scanner. The dunes stretched endlessly in every direction, their undulating shapes broken only by jagged outcroppings of dark stone that jutted from the sand like the bones of some ancient, long-dead creature. Mila's eyes flicked to Kane, who moved gracefully like a tiger stalking its prey. She forced her gaze back to the horizon, where the anomaly's shimmer grew faintly stronger, its movement almost imperceptible. "It's slowing," she said, glancing at her scanner. "We're catching up." Kane's voice was low, almost a growl. "Or it's waiting for us." Mila's stomach tightened, but she refused to let fear take hold. This was what she had come to Zephros for: to uncover the unknown, to understand the secrets the planet hid so carefully. If the anomaly was a threat, she would face it. If it was something more, she would unravel its mystery. "Then let's not keep it waiting," she said, her tone firm. Kane glanced at her, a faint smirk pulling at his lips despite the tension in his gaze. "You've got fire," he said quietly. "Let's hope it doesn't burn us both." The two pressed on, the anomaly growing clearer with each step, its shimmering edges resolving into something more tangible. Anticipation and dread mingling as the distance closed. Whatever awaited them, it would be the first piece of the puzzle that Zephros had so carefully laid, and Mila was determined to solve it, no matter the cost. The horizon shimmered with a heat that Zephros had no right to claim, its sun hidden beneath thick veils of perpetual cloud cover. Mila tightened her grip on the scanner as she and Kane descended into the spiderweb of crevices that cut the dunes like veins. The anomaly had led them here, into a network of natural tunnels where the wind howled like a living thing, its sound bouncing in dissonant echoes. The air grew colder as they moved deeper, and the fine, iridescent sand of the surface gave way to dense, crystalline formations that jutted from the walls like jagged teeth. The shimmering crystals seemed to hum faintly, a sound on the very edge of perception that made the hairs on Mila's arms stand on end. She paused to adjust the scanner. "This can't be right," she muttered, frowning at the screen. Her voice, though quiet, seemed to echo unnaturally in the confines of the tunnel. Kane leaned over her shoulder, his gaze narrowing as he tried to interpret the readings. "What's it saying?" he asked, his voice low but steady, a deliberate contrast to the oppressive atmosphere around them. Mila hesitated, unsure if she trusted what she was seeing. The anomaly's electromagnetic signature was intensifying, but it wasn't a simple spike. It was rhythmic, almost deliberate, as though the phenomenon itself was aware of their presence. "It's fluctuating," she said finally, "like it's responding to us." Her words hung in the air, unsettling in their implication. She turned to Kane, her eyes searching his for a reaction, but his expression remained unreadable, a mask of careful calculation. "Zephros doesn't react," he said after a moment, his tone measured and deliberate. "Not without reason." He gestured toward the path ahead, where the walls of the tunnel curved sharply, the crystal's faint glow illuminating the way like ghostly torches. "Whatever's causing this, it's close. Let's keep moving." Mila followed him, her steps careful on the uneven ground. The scanner's hum grew louder with each step, its vibrations thrumming in her hands like a second heartbeat. The rhythmic pulsation seemed to synchronize with her own pulse, an eerie sensation that left her feeling both connected and alienated. She felt a pang of unease, a sense that the planet itself was watching them, its presence looming in every shadow and flicker of light. The thought was absurd, yet it clung to her mind, refusing to be dismissed. "Do you ever wonder what's buried here?" she asked suddenly, her voice cutting through the oppressive silence. Kane glanced back at her, his brow furrowed, his movements deliberate. "I try not to," he said simply. "Some questions don't have answers you want to hear." His tone carried a weight that made Mila's skin prickle. They rounded the curve and the tunnel opened into a vast cavern, its walls shimmering with a kaleidoscope of light reflected off the crystals. The space felt alive, the light shifting and moving as though it had its own will. At the center of the cavern stood a structure that made Mila's breath catch in her throat. It was an obelisk carved from a black stone that seemed to absorb the light around it, its surface etched with intricate patterns that pulsed faintly. The air around it felt charged, as though it were a storm waiting to break. The anomaly's signature was strongest here. "What is that?" she whispered, stepping closer, her voice barely audible but heavy with awe and trepidation. Kane's hand shot out, gripping her arm firmly. "Careful," he said, his tone low and urgent. "We don't know what we're dealing with." Mila shook off his hand, her curiosity overriding her caution. She approached the obelisk slowly, her eyes tracing the patterns etched into its surface. They weren't random, they were deliberate, almost mathematical, as though the structure was a machine waiting to be activated. The air around it vibrated subtly, a sensation that seemed to resonate deep within her chest. "This is it," she said softly, her voice trembling with awe. This is what's been drawing us here. Kane didn't respond immediately. His gaze was fixed on the obelisk, his jaw tight, his stance wary. "And you think it's a good idea to get close to something like this?" he asked finally, his tone edged with skepticism. Mila turned to him, her expression resolute. Kane sighed, rubbing a hand over his face, his movements betraying the tension he tried to suppress. "You're relentless, you know that?" he muttered. Mila's lips twitched into a faint smile. "So I've been told," she said lightly, though her eyes never left the obelisk. She reached out a hand hesitantly, her fingers brushing against its surface. The moment her skin made contact, a surge of energy shot through her, not painful but overwhelming, like a flood of information being poured directly into her mind. She staggered back, her heart pounding, her breathing erratic. "Mila!" Kane's voice was sharp with concern as he caught her arm, steadying her. "I'm fine," she said quickly, though her voice shook. She stared at the obelisk, her mind racing with fragmented images and sensations that defied explanation. "It's not just a structure," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's alive. Or at least, aware." Kane's grip on her arm tightened, his expression darkening. "And what exactly does it want?" he asked, his tone wary. Mila shook her head, her eyes never leaving the obelisk. "I don't know," she admitted, her words laced with unease. "But I think it's been waiting for someone to find it." The cavern suddenly trembled, a low rumble that sent dust and small shards of crystal cascading from the walls. Mila and Kane exchanged a tense glance, the unspoken urgency between them palpable. "We need to move," Kane said urgently, his hand still gripping her arm. Mila nodded, though her gaze lingered on the obelisk for a moment longer, a mix of awe and apprehension in her eyes. As they turned to leave, the patterns on its surface flared brightly, filling the cavern with a pulsing light that seemed to follow their movements. The scanner's readings were chaotic now, the device emitting a high-pitched whine that set Mila's teeth on edge. They reached the tunnel entrance just as the rumbling grew louder, the ground beneath their feet shaking violently. Kane pulled Mila forward, his voice urgent. "Come on. Whatever's happening, we don't want to be here for it." Mila didn't argue, her heart pounding as they sprinted through the tunnel. The light from the obelisk chased them, flickering like a warning beacon, until they emerged into the open air. Gasping for breath, the winds had picked up, the dunes shifting and swirling in a chaotic dance that mirrored the storm raging in Mila's mind. She turned back toward the tunnel, her chest tightening as the entrance collapsed in on itself, sealing the obelisk inside with a final, resonant crash. Kane placed a hand on her shoulder, his expression grave. "Whatever that was," he said quietly, his voice heavy with meaning, "is just the beginning." Mila nodded, her gaze fixed on the collapsed tunnel. She didn't have the words to respond, but in her heart, she knew he was right. Zephros had given them a glimpse of its secrets, and it wasn't finished with them yet. Kane's voice broke the silence that had stretched between them. "We need to figure out what this thing is capable of," he said, his tone heavier now, layered with more than just fear. There was something else, a flicker of anticipation. Mila tore her gaze from the collapsed tunnel and turned back to the shifting sands. The winds were relentless now, tugging at her clothes as if the planet itself was trying to pull her into its embrace. "And who else might already know about it?" she added, her voice steadier than she felt. She could see it in Kane's eyes. The quiet admission that the obelisk wasn't the only force they had to contend with. The planet was full of secrets, but perhaps even more dangerous were those who sought to control them. Mila adjusted her pack as they moved away from the collapsed tunnel, the shifting sands crunching underfoot. The planet's wind howled louder now, carrying a faint, high-pitched tone that felt eerily like a warning. She glanced at Kane, who had taken the lead, his posture tense and his hand never straying far from the holster on his belt. Though they had left the cavern behind, its lingering presence seemed to follow them, pressing against the back of Mila's mind. The obelisk's light still burned in her memory, vivid and unyielding. She fought the urge to look back, knowing full well that the collapse had buried it, for now. "Do you think anyone else has been out here?" Mila asked, breaking the silence. She kept her voice low, but the question hung in the air like a challenge. Kane didn't turn, his eyes scanning the horizon ahead. "If they have, they didn't leave anything for us to find," he replied. His tone was clipped, but not dismissive. "Places like this don't stay forgotten forever. Eventually, someone with the wrong intentions always stumbles in." Mila's mind raced. If Kane's suspicions were right, they weren't alone. Not in a literal sense, and not in the way Zephros itself seemed to loom over their every move. She clutched her scanner tight, her fingers brushing against its smooth surface. The device's display was empty now, the anomaly's readings having dissipated after the collapse. But the silence on the screen didn't comfort her. It felt more like the calm before the storm. As they descended another dune, the sands gave way to harder terrain, where jagged outcroppings of black stone jutted skyward like skeletal remains. Kane stopped abruptly, holding up a hand. Mila froze behind him, her breath catching. He crouched low, his eyes focused on the ground ahead. Mila followed his gaze and saw it. A faint, almost imperceptible track cutting through the stone. It wasn't natural. The edges were too clean. Kane ran his fingers along the grooves, his brow furrowed. "This isn't ours," he said, his voice barely audible over the wind. "Someone's been here recently." "Recently?" she whispered, leaning closer. Kane nodded, standing and brushing the sand from his gloves. "Days, maybe less," he said. "They weren't just passing through either. These tracks lead straight toward the anomaly's coordinates." Mila stared at the grooves, her mind spinning. Whoever had made them, they were likely after the same thing she and Kane had just encountered. Or worse, they already knew more than she did. "Do you think they reached the cavern?" she asked, her voice tinged with unease. Kane didn't answer immediately. He was already moving again, his boots crunching against the brittle stone. Mila hurried to keep pace, her thoughts a whirlwind of possibilities. If there were others here, they might not be friendly, and if they'd seen the obelisk, they might not leave without taking whatever secrets it held. During her training, she had heard of rebel groups being sent to different planets, looking for rare energy sources or materials for the next generation of weapons. Even worse, she knew of drifters that were left behind from the Great Spice War. They were known to hole up on forgotten planets and never missed an opportunity for trouble, if presented. "If they made it to the cavern, we'll find signs of them," Kane said finally, his tone grim. "But that's not the part that worries me." Mila frowned, her steps faltering. "What do you mean?" she asked. Kane glanced over his shoulder, his expression dark. "If they didn't make it," he said, "we'll find signs of that too. His words hit like a blow, the weight of their implications settling over Mila like a shroud. She swallowed hard, her gaze shifting to the jagged horizon. Zephros had a way of consuming those who didn't belong, and Mila was beginning to wonder if she was any different, as if she was a parasite that needed to die. They pressed on in silence, the wind whipping at their faces. The terrain grew harsher as they climbed, the black stone slick with some strange mineral residue that reflected the dim light. Mila's scanner remained quiet, the lack of data unnerving her more than any spike in readings would have. She glanced at Kane, whose hand hovered obsessively near his holster. "Do you think they knew what they were walking into?" she asked suddenly, her voice tinged with bitterness. Kane's lips curved into a faint, humorless smile. "No one ever does," he said. "That's what gets them killed." She didn't like the finality in his tone, the way he spoke as if survival was a gamble they'd already lost. She wanted to argue, to push back against his cynicism, but the words died in her throat. She couldn't deny what she had seen, or felt. The obelisk wasn't just a relic or a signal. It was something more, something alive, and she had no idea what it wanted from them. They crested a ridge, and Kane stopped abruptly, his hand raised again. Mila froze. Below them, the ground opened into another wide expanse, the black stone broken by deep fissures that glowed faintly with an otherworldly light. At the center of the expanse was a structure, smaller than the obelisk, but no less strange. It resembled a pedestal, its surface covered in the same intricate patterns Mila had seen before, and around it were figures. Mila's breath hitched. At least 4 of them, moving with precision around the pedestal. They were dressed in cloaks of deep grey, their movements purposeful and coordinated. Mila strained to make out their faces, but they were obscured by masks, the design unfamiliar. "Who are they?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Kane didn't answer. His jaw was set, his gaze fixed on the figures below. Slowly he crouched, motioning for Mila to do the same. "Keep your head down." "Who are they?" Mila whispered, crouching beside Kane. He shook his head. "Not locals, too organized, too equipped." His tone darkened. "Could be a crew sent by one of the corporations or worse, drifters from the war." Mila's mind raced. If they were dealing with a corporate expedition, it meant resources, weaponry, and agendas far beyond their own. If they were independents, it meant desperation and unpredictability. "We can't just leave it to them," Mila said, her voice steadier than she felt. Kane shot her a sharp look. "And what exactly are we supposed to do? Walk down there and introduce ourselves?" He gestured toward the figures below. "We're outnumbered, outgunned, and we don't even know what that thing is." Mila felt frustration flare within her. "If they figure it out before we do, we'll never get a chance," she argued. "Whatever these artifacts are, they're connected. If we let this one slip, we lose the bigger picture." Kane sighed heavily, rubbing a hand over his face. "You really don't know how to back down, do you?" he muttered. Mila offered a faint smile. "Not when I'm right," she replied. "Fine," he said, his tone resigned. "But we do this smart. No heroics." Mila nodded, having a hard time ignoring the strange sense of intrigue towards Kane. Years of training with the Benevolent taught her to ignore and override the distractions of any feelings that didn't serve the mission. Of course, she had no problem doing so, but the fact she had any inkling of desire for this man surprised her. The descent into the valley was slow and methodical, each step calculated to avoid drawing attention. The cloaks they wore were intricately designed, their patterns shimmering faintly in the dim light. Mila couldn't shake the feeling that these weren't mere scavengers or hired muscle. These people belonged here, as though they were part of the planet itself. Kane motioned for her to stop as they reached the edge of the innermost circle. From here, the altar was clearly visible, its surface covered in symbols that glowed faintly, pulsing in a rhythm that seemed to resonate with the hum of the scanner. One of the figures stepped forward, placing a hand on the altar. The glow intensified, and Mila caught her breath as a beam of light shot upward from the center of the structure, piercing the heavy clouds above. The beam flickered, unstable, before settling into a steady column of energy. "What are they doing?" Mila whispered. Kane shook his head, activating it, or trying to. His voice was tense, and she could see the tightness in his jaw, the way his hand hovered near his weapon. "We need to move," he said, his voice low. "If they get it working—" He didn't finish the thought, but Mila understood. Whatever the altar was, it was powerful, and if it fell into the wrong hands, the consequences could be catastrophic. They edged closer, using the uneven terrain for cover. Mila felt the tension between them, the unspoken understanding that this was a gamble, a dangerous one. As they neared the figures, she caught fragments of their speech, their language unfamiliar but melodic. It was like they were chanting or singing. The words sent a chill down her spine, their cadence perfectly in tune with the pulsing light of the altar. Kane motioned for her to stay low as he inched forward. Mila clenched the scanner, her knuckles white as she tried to steady her breathing. The figures hadn't noticed them yet, their focus entirely on the altar. But something felt off. The thought had barely formed in her mind when the ground beneath her shifted, a subtle but unmistakable tremor. Kane froze, his head snapping toward her. "Did you—" Before he could finish, the tremor intensified, a deep rumble that seemed to emanate from the altar itself. The figures paused, their heads turning in unison toward the source of the disturbance. One of them raised a hand and Mila saw a device clutched in their grip. Something sleek and metallic, its surface etched with the same symbols as the altar. "Run!" Kane hissed. But it was too late. The figure turned toward them, their gaze locking onto Mila's position. A sharp metallic sound rang out as the device in their hand flared to life, emitting a beam of light that seared through the air just inches from where Mila crouched. She scrambled backward as debris from the rock sprayed everywhere. Kane grabbed her arm and pulled her behind a nearby boulder. "Our cover is blown," he muttered, his tone grim. "Stay down." He drew his weapon, the sleek barrel glinting faintly in the light from the altar. Mila's mind raced, panic threatening to overtake her as the figures began to converge on their position. But beneath the fear, she felt something else, a spark of defiance. Zephros hadn't brought her here to run. Whatever the altar was, whatever the figures wanted, she wouldn't let them claim it without a fight. Mila's breath came in sharp bursts as she crouched low behind the jagged rock formation. Her body pressed against the uneven surface. The cloaked figures moved with precision below, their silhouettes lit by the steady beam of light that continued to pulse from the altar. She chanced a glance toward Kane, who was hunched beside her, his weapon drawn and his gaze locked on their pursuers. The tremors from the artifact's activation had subsided, but the energy in the air was palpable, a tension that made every nerve in her body scream to run. Yet running would be suicide. They were outnumbered, and the valley offered little in the way of cover. Kane motioned silently, his hand cutting through the air in a signal that Mila had come to recognize. Move left. She nodded, gripping the scanner tightly as she edged along the rock face. The figures below hadn't spotted them yet, but the way they moved, coordinated and purposeful, suggested it was only a matter of time. Mila's heart raced as she reached a narrow crevice that led deeper into the rock formation. She slipped inside, the shadows swallowing her whole. Kane followed, his steps silent but swift, his presence a steadying force in the chaos. The crevice led to a narrow path that wound upward, offering a vantage point over the valley. Mila climbed carefully, her mind racing as she tried to make sense of what she'd seen. The altar, the patterns, the cloaked figures, it all pointed to something in particular, something the planet itself was hiding. But it wasn't mystical or magical. Mila had spent her life chasing tangible truths, unraveling the physical and chemical mysteries of the universe. Whatever was happening here, it had to have an explanation rooted in reality. And yet, the precision of the figures below, their near reverence for the artifact, made her question how much she truly understood about Zephros. Reaching the top of the ridge, Mila flattened herself against the rock and peered over the edge. From here, the full scale of the valley became clear. The altar stood at its center, but the surrounding terrain wasn't natural. The concentric circles weren't just patterns. They were barriers, trenches filled with a shimmering liquid that refracted the faint light into a spectrum of colors. Mila's eyes widened. It wasn't water. The viscosity was wrong, the way it moved almost jelly-like. She adjusted the scanner and pointed it toward the trenches, her stomach sinking as the readings came through. The substance emitted a low-frequency electromagnetic field, one that matched the obelisk and the artifact they'd found earlier. This wasn't just a geological anomaly. It was connected, part of the same system. Kane's voice was low and urgent. They're moving toward the ridge. Mila's head snapped up and saw the figures ascending the slope, their formation tight. This wasn't random pursuit. They knew exactly where to look. How? She whispered, the question more to herself than to Kane. He didn't answer, his focus shifting to their surroundings. Her gaze lingering on the altar below. The scanner's data scrolled across the screen, chaotic and incomplete, but she couldn't leave it behind. They were close, closer than anyone had likely ever been to understanding what made Zephros so unique. But what would that matter if they didn't survive the next few moments? Kane grabbed her arm, pulling her out of her thoughts. Now, he said firmly. Mila didn't argue, tucking the scanner into her pack as they slipped back into the shadows of the crevice. The path was narrow, the walls pressing close on either side as they moved deeper into the formation. Who were these people? What was their connection to the altar? And why did the substance in the trenches feel so controlled? The sound of voices echoed through the crevice, their language unfamiliar but rhythmic, almost chant-like. Mila's skin prickled as she realized how close they were. She glanced at Kane, who had stopped ahead of her, his weapon raised and his body tense. "They're blocking the exit," he murmured, his tone grim. They were trapped. Kane's gaze darted around the narrow space, his mind working at a furious pace. "We go up," he said finally, pointing to a jagged outcropping that led to a higher vantage point. Mila followed his gaze, her stomach twisting at the sight. The climb was steep and exposed, the kind of maneuver that would leave them vulnerable if even one figure spotted them. But there was no other choice. She nodded, swallowing her fear as she began to climb. The rock was rough under her hands, its surface sharp and uneven. She focused on each movement, forcing herself to ignore the voices that grew louder below. Cain was right behind her, his presence reassuring. The wind picked up as they neared the top. The sand it carried cut right through Mila's jacket. She gritted her teeth, her fingers raw and aching as she hauled herself onto the ledge. Cain joined her a moment later, his breathing heavy but controlled. From this height, the valley stretched out like a map, its intricate patterns both beautiful and unsettling. But there was no time to admire the view. The figures were directly below them now, their movements methodical as they navigated the crevice. Mila's chest tightened when she realized how exposed they were. Cain crouched low, his gaze scanning the terrain for a way out. "There," he said, pointing to a narrow path that led down the other side of the ridge. It was risky, steep and uneven, but it was their only chance. Mila nodded, her heart pounding as they began the descent. The path was treacherous, the loose rocks shifting underfoot with every step. Mila's breath hitched as her foot slipped, sending a cascade of pebbles tumbling into the valley below. The voices paused, their rhythm breaking as the figures turned toward the sound. Cain swore under his breath, grabbing Mila's arm to steady her. "Keep moving," he hissed. Mila forced herself to focus. Cain didn't stop, his steps quick and purposeful as he led her toward a cluster of rocks that offered cover. It happened in an instant. One moment she was climbing down the jagged formation, and the next she was thrust into the desert. There was nothing surrounding her but the fine, powdery sand of Zephros. The heat from the sand bent the air into thick cords that wriggled like snakes. She was entirely alone. The silence was deafening. As she felt the beads of sweat begin to form on her forehead, she heard a voice, almost like a faint whisper. "You have no right. You don't know the power you are seeking." Mila desperately tried to call out, "Who are you? Where are you? What do you mean?" The voice whispered back, "You have known me this whole time." Mila woke up to Cain holding her by the shoulders. His face was merely inches from hers. "Are you okay?" he asked. She muttered, "Yes, No time to talk. We have to keep moving." He replied quickly. They slipped behind the rocks just as the figures reached the ridge. Mila pressed herself against the stone, still dazed from the vision she just had. Cain's gaze was fixed on the figures. "They'll search this area next," he said. "We need to stay ahead of them." Mila nodded. They had escaped for now, but the figures weren't giving up. Whatever the substance in the trenches was, it held the key to Zephros, and Mila was determined to find it before anyone else did. The sunless skies of Zephros offered no solace as Mila and Cain trudged deeper into the jagged terrain. The narrow escape had left Mila feeling rattled, and though the immediate danger seemed to have passed, her senses remained sharp, every sound amplified in the silence. The cloaked figures were still out there scouring the ridge, their synchronized movements and unwavering focus unsettling. Mila couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't just chasing intruders, they were protecting something far more significant. Her vision felt like a distant daydream, and she had trouble recalling the details. Cain walked ahead, his posture rigid, the tension in his shoulders betraying the calm he tried to project. His hand stayed glued to his holster, ready to draw at the first sign of trouble. Mila followed, her eyes scanning the uneven ground for any signs of traps or surveillance. The thought of the liquid-filled trenches lingered in her mind. The substance wasn't natural. It couldn't be. Its electromagnetic properties were unlike anything she had encountered, and yet the cloaked figures had treated it with a reverence that suggested they knew far more than she and Kane ever could. How far are we from the next set of coordinates? Kane's voice broke through her thoughts, low and steady. Mila pulled out the scanner, its screen still flickering erratically from their earlier encounter with the altar. She tapped at the controls, the device's hum filling the silence as it recalibrated. 5 kilometers, she said. But the terrain ahead looks rough. If we stick to this pace, we'll reach it by nightfall. Kane nodded, but his gaze remained fixed on the horizon. We can't afford to stop, he said. Not until we're sure they've lost our trail. Mila wanted to argue, to insist that they needed rest, but the look in Kane's eyes silenced her. He wasn't just worried about the cloaked figures catching up, he was anticipating it. The weight of their predicament settling heavily on her shoulders. There was only enough time for some water and to tend to some wounds, which were minor, luckily. You need to keep it still, Kane said as he rewrapped Mila's hand. It was shaking, and for good reason. She looked in his eyes, and for a brief moment she remembered a memory from her childhood. It was a light feeling and lasted only for a fleeting moment. The terrain grew harsher as they pressed on. Mila's boots slipped more than once on the loose gravel, her muscles burning as she struggled to keep up with Kane's unrelenting pace. The scanner's readings fluctuated wildly, its sensors struggling to process the electromagnetic interference that seemed to permeate the air. Mila frowned as she studied the data. The interference wasn't random, it was localized, strongest in the direction they were heading. What do you think we're walking into? She asked, breaking the silence. Kane glanced back at her, his expression unreadable. Something worth protecting, he said simply. His tone was calm, but there was a weight to his words that made Mila's stomach twist. She turned her attention back to the scanner. A mineral deposit? A chemical reservoir? Whatever it wasn't just valuable. It was dangerous. The ground leveled out as they reached the crest of a small hill, revealing a shallow basin below. The landscape here was different, the jagged rocks replaced by smooth, continuous formations that seemed almost sculpted. Mila's breath caught as she noticed the faint shimmer of the trenches, the same liquid-filled barriers they had seen at the altar. The basin stretched for hundreds of meters, the trenches crisscrossing the terrain in intricate patterns that looked almost strategic. Kane crouched low, motioning for Mila to do the same. "They're here," he growled. Mila followed his gaze and felt her chest tighten. The cloaked figures were moving through the basin. There were more of them now, their numbers nearly double what they had seen at the altar. They carried the same devices, their sleek surfaces glinting faintly in the dim light. "We need to get closer," Kane said. Mila hesitated, her instincts screaming against the idea. "Closer?" she whispered, her voice sharp. "Do you see how many of them there are? We barely escaped the last time." Kane's gaze hardened. "If we don't figure out what's down there, we're blind," he said. "And blind gets us killed." Mila bit her lip, her mind swirling with possibilities. Kane was right. They couldn't afford to walk away now. She took a deep breath, nodding reluctantly. "Fine," she said, "but we do this carefully. No risks." Kane smirked faintly, the tension between them easing for a moment. "Careful is the only way I operate," he said lightly, earning a skeptical look from Mila. They moved cautiously down the hill, using the undulating terrain for cover. The closer they got to the basin, the more apparent it became that the trenches weren't just barriers. They were conduits. The liquid inside them pulsed faintly, its glow matching the rhythm of the electromagnetic interference on Mila's scanner. She adjusted the settings, narrowing the focus of the sensors. The readings spiked instantly, the screen flooding with data. Mila's eyes widened as she processed the information. The liquid wasn't just emitting energy, it was storing it, amplifying it. "It's a power source," she whispered, her voice trembling with both awe and apprehension. Kane shot her a glance, his expression sharp. "A power source for what?" Mila shook her head, unable to answer. The implications were staggering. If the liquid was capable of generating and storing energy at this scale, it wasn't just rare, it was revolutionary. Her mind immediately went to some bad actor using this untapped energy source for something evil like high-energy weapons or firepower. They reached the edge of the basin, crouching low behind a cluster of rocks. The cloaked figures were close now, their voices carrying faintly on the wind. Mila strained to hear, but the language was still unfamiliar, its cadence rhythmic and deliberate. She adjusted the scanner again, this time aiming it toward the figures. The device hummed softly, its sensors picking up faint traces of biological data. Mila frowned as she studied the screen. The figures weren't human, or at least not entirely. "Kane," she whispered, her voice tight. "The scanner's picking up anomalies in their physiology. They're not like us." Kane's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. His gaze remained fixed on the figures, his hand resting on the grip of his weapon. Mila felt a pang of unease. Kane was always steady, always focused. But there was something different now, a tension in him that she couldn't quite place. At the mention of the visitors, his body strained, almost like he was trying to fight something off. The sound of footsteps broke through her thoughts. She froze as she realized one of the figures was approaching their position. Kane's finger tightened on the trigger of his weapon. Mila held her breath, every muscle in her body tense as the figure drew closer. Mila's breath hitched as the figure stopped just meters away, their cloak rippling faintly in the Zephros wind. The rhythmic purr of the trenches seemed to grow louder. She kept perfectly still, her chest pressed tightly against the jagged rock that shielded her from view. The scanner in her pack emitted a faint beep, its readings momentarily spiking. She winced, silently willing the device to go quiet. The figure tilted their head slightly, their masked face turning toward her position as if they had heard something. A whisper, a heartbeat. Kane moved with glacial precision. Mila wanted to stop him, to grab his arm and shake her head, but she knew better. Any sudden movement could give them away. The figure took a cautious step forward, their boots crunching softly against the rocky terrain. Mila's eyes darted to Kane, who was now in position to draw if necessary. His expression was unreadable, his body coiled like a spring. The figure hesitated, then turned abruptly, their attention pulled toward a shout from another part of the basin. Mila exhaled shakily as they walked away, their strides purposeful as they rejoined the group near the trenches. Kane didn't relax. His hand remained on his weapon, his gaze tracking the figure's every move. Mila reached out, her hand brushing his arm. "We need to go," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Kane nodded once and they slipped back into the shadows of the ridge. Mila watched Kane move forward and thought it was weird when she started to see the outline of his body double. Everything in her periphery started to blend into blurry strokes of color. Her ears started to ring. She saw the tree from her grandma's farm, that big, towering chestnut. Although something was different about it, there were shafts of light piercing through it. She walked towards it and began to see little crescent-shaped holes throughout its trunk and limbs. The light began to oscillate between the holes, swirling in a mesmerizing pattern. Mila heard the faint whisperings, almost as if carried on the wind. "Trust no one on this planet," it said. She responded desperately, "What do you mean? Who are you?" As the entire tree illuminated into a bright orb, the wind picked up to a deafening roar. Mila regained consciousness with one knee on the hard ground and her head in her hands. Kane stared at her with a fearful gaze. "You were muttering something," he said. Mila stood up and brushed off her suit. "I can't explain, at least not right now," she replied, and continued to walk past him. The tension in Mila's chest didn't ease until they were far from the basin, the glow of the trenches a faint blur on the horizon. They crouched in a shallow gully, hidden from view but close enough to observe the movements of the cloaked figures from a distance. Kane leaned back against the rock, running a hand over his face. "That was too close," he muttered, his tone edged with frustration. Mila pulled out the scanner. The device's readings had stabilized, but the data it had collected and her strange dream was enough to send her mind spinning. "They're not just guarding the trenches," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos in her thoughts. Kane raised an eyebrow, his expression skeptical. "What do you mean?" Mila turned the scanner toward him, the screen glowing faintly in the dim light. "The liquid. It's not just a power source. It's reactive. The readings show it amplifies energy, but it also adapts to environmental changes. It's alive, in a way, not sentient, but responsive." Kane frowned, his gaze flicking between Mila and the scanner. "Responsive how?" Mila shook her head, struggling to put the data into words. "It's like it's part of a system. The trenches are conduits, and whatever the cloaked figures are doing, they're interacting with it. Controlling it, maybe." Kane's expression darkened, his jaw tightening. "Or protecting it." The word hung in the air, heavy with implication. If the cloaked figures were protecting the substance, it wasn't just because of its value. It was because of what it could do. She thought back to the patterns on the altar, the way the liquid had pulsed in rhythm with the electromagnetic interference. It wasn't just a resource. It was a weapon, or at least the key to one. Kane pushed off the rock. "We need more information," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Whatever's happening here, it's bigger than we thought." Mila nodded. The cloaked figures weren't just a threat. They were the key to understanding Zephros, but approaching them again was a risk she wasn't sure they could take. Kane seemed to sense her hesitation. He crouched beside her, his voice low but firm. "We're not getting off this planet without answers," he said. "And if we don't figure this out, someone else will." Mila met his gaze, the intensity in his eyes both reassuring and unnerving. She nodded slowly, steeling herself for what lay ahead. "Then we'll figure it out," she said, her voice steady. "No more close calls." Kane smirked faintly. Mila allowed herself a small smile. Her gaze shifted back toward the basin, the faint glow of the trenches, a constant reminder of the danger they faced. "And I think we're running out of time." The gully offered some protection from the biting winds of Zephros, but Mila couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The glow of the trenches in the distance added an eerie backdrop. She adjusted the scanner again. Kane was beside her, his gaze scanning the horizon with a sharpness that suggested he didn't trust the temporary lull in their pursuit. "We need to find higher ground," Kane said, his voice low and resolute. "If we stay in this gully, they'll trap us the moment they figure out we doubled back." Mila nodded, slipping the scanner into her pack and pulling herself upright. Her legs ached from the earlier climb, but she pushed the discomfort aside. They couldn't afford to stop now. Kane led the way, his movements cautious, his hand never straying far from his holster. Mila followed close behind, her mind poring over the visions she had and their hidden warnings. As they ascended the rocky slope, Mila's thoughts drifted back to the cloaked figures and the strange liquid in the trenches. The scanner's readings had revealed something she hadn't yet told Kane. Something she wasn't sure she could put into words. The substance wasn't just reactive, adapting to the environment around it. The implications were staggering. If the liquid could be harnessed, it could revolutionize energy systems, weaponry, even terraforming. But the idea of it falling into the wrong hands made her stomach churn. They reached the top of the ridge, the terrain flattening into a narrow plateau. The view from here was breathtaking, the endless expanse of Zephros stretching out before them. Mila paused, her gaze drawn to the faint glimmers of light in the distance, the trenches, their glow unrelenting. She shivered, the weight of the planet's secrets pressing heavily on her. Kane crouched near the edge of the plateau. "No movement," he said, his tone edged with suspicion. "But that doesn't mean they're not out there." Mila knelt beside him, pulling out the scanner again. The device hummed softly as it processed the electromagnetic interference that saturated the air. The readings were subtle but clear. The cloaked figures were nearby, their presence marked by faint energy signatures that moved with precision. "They're circling," she said quietly, showing the screen to Kane. "They're trying to cut us off." "Then we keep moving," he said. "Stay ahead of them. We'll loop back toward the next coordinates once we've lost their trail." Mila hesitated. "If we don't figure out what they're protecting, we're just running blind," she said. Kane turned to her, his expression unreadable. Mila sighed, knowing he was right. She tucked the scanner back into her pack and followed as Kane moved along the plateau, their steps muffled by the rocky terrain. The wind picked up, carrying with it a faint metallic tang that made Mila's skin prickle. She glanced at Kane, who seemed unfazed, his focus unwavering. But the tension in his posture told her he felt it too. The planet's subtle resistance, the way it seemed to push back against their presence. As they rounded a bend, Mila stumbled, her foot catching on an uneven patch of ground. She steadied herself, her heart racing as a wave of dizziness washed over her. The edges of her vision blurred, and for a moment, she thought she saw something, a flicker of movement, a shadow that wasn't there. She shook her head, blinking hard. "You okay?" Kane asked, his tone sharp with concern. Mila nodded quickly, brushing it off. "Yeah, just tired," she said. But the truth was harder to dismiss. She had seen something, felt something, and it left her unsettled. They pressed on, the wind growing stronger as they reached the far side of the plateau. The terrain sloped downward into a dense cluster of jagged rock formations, their sharp edges casting long shadows in the dim light. Kane slowed, his gaze scanning the path ahead. "This way," he said, motioning for Mila to follow. The rocks provided some cover, but they also created blind spots, places where an ambush could easily be staged. Mila's nerves were on edge as they moved through the narrow pass, her senses heightened by the silence. She adjusted the scanner, the device's readings flickering faintly as it struggled to keep up with the electromagnetic interference. "We're close to something," she said, her voice low. "Let's hope it's not them," he muttered. The energy here was concentrated, almost identical to the readings from the trenches. "This is part of it," she said, her voice trembling with realization. "The trenches, the altar, they're connected to this." Kane knelt beside her. "What is it?" he asked. "I don't know yet," she admitted. "But whatever it is, it's big, and the cloaked figures aren't just protecting it, they're using it." The faint sound of footsteps echoed off the canyon wall. Mila gasped quietly as she turned, her gaze locking onto the shadowy figures emerging from the pass. Kane unholstered his weapon. "Stay behind me," he said, his voice low but firm. Mila's heart raced as the figures closed in, their cloaks rippling in the wind. The moment of respite was over, and the chase had begun again. The cloaked figures moved as one, their coordinated steps echoing faintly in the enclosed pass. Mila and Kane pressed themselves against the jagged rock wall. Kane's hand rested on the grip of his weapon, his eyes fixed on the path ahead. "We can't stay here," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "If they find us pinned, we're done." The narrow pass offered little in the way of escape routes, the walls too steep and the ground too exposed. The energy readings were stronger here, concentrated in a way that made her stomach churn. The sound of a sharp metallic click broke through the silence, and Mila's blood ran cold. One of the figures had activated their device. Kane grabbed her arm, pulling her into the shadows of a nearby rock outcropping. They crouched low, their breaths shallow as the figure scanned the pass. Mila could see the faint shimmer of the energy field now, a ripple in the air that distorted the light around it. It was beautiful and terrifying all at once. Kane leaned close, his voice barely above a whisper. "We need to split up, draw them away from the path." Mila turned to him, her eyes widening in alarm. "Are you insane?" she hissed. "If we split up, they'll pick us off one by one." Kane's expression hardened, his determination unyielding. "It's the only way," he said firmly. "If we stay together, we're too easy to track." She hated the idea of separating, but Kane was right. They couldn't outrun the figures as a pair. She nodded reluctantly. "Fine," she said, "but if you get caught—" Kane cut her off with a faint smirk. "I won't," he said. "Meet me at the next ridge. If I'm not there in an hour, keep going." Mila swallowed hard, the weight of his words settling over her like a shroud. She wanted to argue, to tell him he was being reckless, but there was no time. Kane moved first, slipping through the shadows with practiced ease. Mila waited, her body tense as she watched him disappear into the darkness. She couldn't help to think that her mission here was already a success. She searched and probed so many other planets just to find nothing. Yet on Zephros, she finally found something worthwhile. Her mission was to investigate for potential chemicals, minerals, or energy sources that could be extorted. Isn't what she found here proof enough? She has all the data she needs. Electromagnetic readings, atmospheric properties, and visual proof that this potent energy elixir sits right on the planet's surface. Would her order be satisfied? Probably, but she couldn't deny the thrill of going further and finding out what all this means. Just as she realized her hesitation was holding them back, she felt something tug at her shoulder. She whipped around and saw one of the cloaked figures nearly inches from her. She yelped and kicked, which landed her on her back. She scuttled backward across the rock. The figure stood motionless. There was a hissing noise coming from its mouth or mask. Does it even have a mouth? She felt dominated by its presence, and once she put enough distance between herself and it, she took off at a sprint. She wheeled around and neared the edge of the pass. The ground opened into another clearing. This one was smaller than the basin, but the grooves in the ground were even more intricate, their patterns forming a complex web that radiated outward from a central point. At the center of the clearing stood another artifact, smaller than the altar but no less strange. It resembled a spire, its surface carved with the same symbols that had adorned the obelisk. Mila's breath caught as she approached the spire, her scanner humming softly in her hands. The readings were unlike anything she had seen before, the energy levels impossibly high. She reached out a hand, hesitating as her fingers hovered just above the surface. The air around the spire seemed to vibrate, a subtle hum that resonated in her chest. The sound of hissing shattered the moment, and Mila spun around. One of the cloaked figures stood at the edge of the clearing, their masked face turned toward her. The figure stepped forward, their movements purposeful but not aggressive. They raised a hand, palm out, in what Mila recognized as possibly a gesture of peace. She froze. The figure's presence wasn't threatening. It was almost curious. Who were these people, and what did they want with the artifacts? The figure took another step forward, their hand still raised. Mila realized the truth. They weren't just protecting the spire. They were inviting her to understand it. Her mind churned as the cloaked figure glided closer, their presence both unsettling and oddly calm. The figure's mask caught the faint light, its design intricate and alien, with angular etchings that swirled in a tight pattern. Mila held her ground, her fingers tightening around the scanner as she weighed her options. The figure didn't speak, but their body language was clear. They were not here to attack, at least not yet. "What do you want?" Mila asked, her voice steadied. The figure tilted their heads slightly, their hands still raised in a gesture of peace. Mila's pulse raced as she considered the possibilities. Were they trying to communicate? To warn her? Or was this some kind of ruse to lure her into a trap? The figure gestured toward the spire. Mila hesitated, her gaze shifting between the artifact and the figure. The spire buzzed with energy, its surface emitting a soft glow that matched the energy field Mila had detected earlier. She swallowed hard. Mila's instincts screamed at her to retreat, to find Kane and regroup before making any decisions, but the scientist in her couldn't ignore the opportunity. This was the closest she had ever been to understanding Zephros, to uncovering the secrets that had drawn her to this desolate planet in the first place. She adjusted the scanner, the device humming as it began to analyze the spire's structure. The readings were chaotic, the energy levels off the charts. Whatever the spire was, it wasn't just a relic, it was a catalyst. The figure moved closer, their posture still non-threatening. Mila stepped back instinctively. She couldn't trust them. She couldn't trust anyone here, but she also couldn't afford to let this moment slip away. "What is this?" she asked, her voice firm but laced with curiosity. The figure didn't respond, their silence unnerving. Instead, they pointed again to the spire, their gesture more insistent this time. Mila took a tentative step forward, her gaze fixed on the artifact. The air around it seemed to shimmer, the energy field almost palpable. She reached out a hand, stopping just short of the surface. Her fingers hovered inches from the carvings, the symbols glowing faintly as if responding to her presence. The moment stretched, tension thick in the air. A sharp sound broke through the silence, and Mila spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. Another figure had entered the clearing, their movements faster, more aggressive than the first. Mila's instincts flared, her body tensing as she prepared to run. The first figure turned toward the newcomer, their posture shifting into something defensive. Mila watched in stunned silence as the two figures exchanged a series of gestures. It was a language, Mila realized, one she couldn't understand. The second figure pointed toward Mila, their stance rigid with authority. The first figure hesitated, their hand dropping to their side. Mila's chest tightened as she realized she was losing whatever fragile advantage she might have had. The second figure took a step closer, their presence more menacing. Mila's grip on the scanner tightened as she calculated her next move. She could make a break for the pass, but the odds of escaping unscathed were slim. Before Mila could act, the first figure raised a hand, their gesture stopping the second in their tracks. The tension between them was palpable, an unspoken argument playing out in the flicker of their movements. These people, or whatever they weren't just a unified force. They had their own divisions, their own conflicts, and that meant she might have a chance. The first figure turned back to Mila, their posture more urgent now. They pointed to the spire again, their movements almost pleading. Mila hesitated, her gaze shifting between the figures and the artifact. She didn't trust them, but if she could just get closer, just gather more data, she might be able to piece together the puzzle that had haunted her since she'd arrived on Zephros. Summoning her courage, she stepped toward the spire. The symbols on its surface flared brighter as she approached, their light casting faint shadows on the ground. She adjusted the scanner, the device emitting a high-pitched whine as it struggled to process the overwhelming energy. Mila's hand hovered over the carvings, barely breathing as the air around her seemed to buzz. The second figure moved abruptly, their stance aggressive as they reached for a device at their side. Mila froze, her heart pounding as she realized the precariousness of her position. The first figure stepped between her and the second, their gestures sharp and forceful. Mila didn't wait to see how the standoff would end. She pressed the scanner against the spire. The readings were incomprehensible, the sheer volume of information overwhelming her senses. A surge of energy shot through her, not painful but disorienting, like a flood of fragmented images and sensations. Mila staggered back, her vision swimming as the scanner slipped from her grasp. There it was again, the vast open desert of Zephros. The sun was baking the sand, but there was no wind, just silence and heat. The horizon before her stretched endlessly. Before she could get her bearing, there was a soft voice. Don't give our secrets away. Protect what is ours. As the words were spoken, Mila felt her body dissolve into the sand, and she closed her eyes briefly. The spire's pulse woke her up in a blinding flash. The figures recoiled, their movements frantic as they shielded themselves from the light. Mila's knees buckled, and she hit the ground hard. As the light faded, the clearing fell silent. The figures were gone, their presence erased as if they had never been there. Mila sat on the ground. The scanner lay nearby, its screen cracked but still glowing faintly. Mila reached for it with trembling hands. The artifact stood unchanged, its symbols dim once more. But Mila knew better. She had seen its power, felt its connection to the planet, and it was far from dormant. Kane's voice broke through the haze, sharp and urgent. "Mila, are you okay?" She turned to see him rushing into the clearing, his face etched with worry. Mila nodded weakly, her voice barely audible. "I'm fine," she said, though she wasn't sure she believed it. Kane helped her to her feet, his gaze shifting to the spire. "What happened here?" he asked. Mila shook her head, her mind too jumbled to form an answer. "I don't know," she admitted. "But we're in deeper than I thought." The air felt heavier now, as though the spire had left an imprint on the atmosphere, a lingering charge that clung to Mila's skin and weighed on her thoughts. Kane's steadying hand on her shoulder brought her back to the present, his grip firm but not forceful. "We need to move," he said, his voice low but urgent. Mila glanced at the spire one last time, its faint glow barely perceptible now, and nodded. Her legs felt unsteady beneath her, but Kane's presence rattled her. She tried to push back the lingering dizziness that clouded her mind. For a fleeting moment, he felt like the enemy. They slipped back into the shadows of the past silently. Mila's thoughts churned as they navigated the rocky terrain, the fragmented images and sensations from the spire replaying in her mind. There had been a message from the planet itself, calling her to action, almost like she was the Redeemer and the power was in her control. The cloaked figures knew it. The first figure was trying to show the other one something by letting her touch the spire. Kane's voice broke through her thoughts. "You're quiet," he said, glancing back at her. His tone was neutral, but Mila caught the undercurrent of concern. "I'm fine," she replied, though the words felt hollow. Kane raised an eyebrow but didn't press her. He turned his attention back to the path ahead. Mila watched him for a moment, a flicker of doubt creeping into her thoughts. Kane had always been the pragmatic one, the steady hand in their partnership, but there was something different about him now, a subtle shift she couldn't quite place. Or maybe the shift was from inside herself. As they climbed higher, the terrain opened into a narrow plateau overlooking the basin. From this vantage point, the trenches glimmered faintly in the distance, their patterns forming a labyrinthine web that seemed almost deliberate. Mila crouched near the edge and stared outward. "Mila, what happened? What did it do to you?" Kane asked, his voice low but urgent. She shook her head, trying to steady her breathing. I don't know," she managed, her voice unsteady. "It wasn't just energy. It was information. Symbols, patterns, like it was trying to tell me something." Kane frowned. "And what did it say?" Mila met his eyes, her jaw tightening. "I don't know yet, but I need to figure it out. I need a moment to analyze what I saw," she said firmly, pulling the scanner from her pack. "Give me some space. I'll call you if I need help." "You're sure you're okay?" Mila nodded, already focused on the scanner. "I'll be fine," she said. "Just keep an eye on our surroundings." Kane stepped back, his gaze lingering on her for a moment before he turned away, his hand resting near his weapon as he surveyed the area. Mila crouched near a flat rock, her fingers flying over the scanner's controls as she connected it to her encrypted terminal. She closed her eyes, forcing herself to focus, to recall the intricate symbols etched into the spire's surface. They hadn't been random. There was a logic to them, a pattern she was determined to unravel. Using the scanner's interface, Mila sketched the symbols from memory. The device hummed softly as it analyzed the data, its algorithms cross-referencing the symbols with every known database she had access to. After a few tense moments, the screen flickered, a single result appearing in the corner of the display. Mila's breath caught as she opened the file, the terminal's screen filling with an excerpt from an ancient archive. The text was fragmented, its edges corrupted by time, but the message it conveyed was chilling in its clarity. The core was designed so that it could never be found. Forged in the era of shifting sands, it was entrusted to the keepers of balance, a covenant not of power, but of preservation. Those who seek to wield it misunderstand its purpose. For the core does not obey, it judges. Beware the shadow that lingers, for it knows no bounds. To awaken the core is to awaken the storm. Mila leaned back, her chest tightening as she reread the words. The symbols matched perfectly, their meaning tied to a history she didn't fully understand. But one thing was clear. The core wasn't just a relic of the past, and whatever force had created it had done so with the intent to protect, not to control. She pulled up the spire's patterns again, overlaying them with the symbols she had just analyzed. The alignment was undeniable, the patterns forming a map, a guide to the core's heart. But there was something else, a detail that sent a shiver through her. At the base of the map was a single phrase, etched in the same ancient script: balance demands sacrifice. The visions, the warnings, the strange energy that pulsed through Zephros, it all pointed to the same conclusion. The core wasn't just a tool, it was a test, and someone, or something, had been waiting for her to find it. As she looked at the data, she noticed her hand wasn't in pain anymore. She gently unwound the wrappings and found that her injury was completely healed, almost as if the spire healed her when she touched. Kane's voice broke through her thoughts, sharp and impatient. "Did you find anything?" She hesitated for a moment before nodding, closing the terminal and securing the scanner in her pack. The knowledge she had gained was hers alone, for now. She wasn't ready to trust him with something this important. Mila adjusted the strap of her pack as she fell in step beside Kane, her eyes narrowing as she studied his profile. "Where exactly were you back there?" she asked, her tone sharp with curiosity. "You disappeared for a while." Kane's gaze flicked to her, his expression unreadable. "I told you," he said, his voice calm but edged with defensiveness. "I was sticking to the plan, splitting up, covering more ground." Mila raised an eyebrow, her skepticism clear. "And that's it? You just happened to vanish right when everything went to hell?" His pace quickening slightly as if to avoid the conversation. "I got sidetracked," he said, finally, his voice clipped. "Sidetracked?" Mila pressed, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "By what? The whole planet is falling apart, and you're out there chasing distractions." Kane stopped abruptly, turning to face her. His eyes met hers, and for a moment, she thought she saw a flicker of something. Hesitation, or maybe guilt. "It's too hard to explain," he said, his voice quieter now, almost resigned. "I think you just need to see it for yourself." Mila's brow furrowed, her frustration giving way to confusion. "See what?" she asked, her tone softening despite herself. Kane didn't answer immediately, his gaze shifting to the horizon, where the faint glow of the trenches lit the barren landscape. "What about the figures?" she asked, her voice rising slightly. "The ones chasing us? Or did you not notice the part where we've been running for our lives?" Kane exhaled sharply, his shoulders dropping as though the weight of the question had hit him hard. "They're part of it," he said. "The tribe, the core, the visions, they're all connected. And whatever I found back there, it changes everything." Mila followed Kane, her footsteps quickening to match his pace. The barren landscape stretched around them. She kept her eyes on his back, her mind churning with questions she couldn't yet form into words. Kane glanced over his shoulder. "It's not something I can explain," he said evenly. "You'll understand when you see it." "That's not exactly reassuring," Mila muttered, though she kept her doubts to herself. She glanced down at the scanner in her hand, its readings stabilizing as they moved farther from the spire. The core's energy was still present, but it seemed distant now, like a whisper receding into silence. They crested a ridge, the ground sloping downward into a narrow canyon. Mila hesitated as Kane led her into the shadows, the walls of the canyon rising around them like the jaws of some great beast. The air was cooler here, heavy with the scent of damp earth and metallic tang. "Kane," she said, her voice low. "Where are we going?" "You'll see," he replied, his tone clipped. He slowed, glancing back at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "But you need to keep an open mind." Mila narrowed her eyes. That's usually what people say before they show you something you really don't want to see. Kane didn't respond, his attention already shifting to a jagged outcropping ahead. He knelt near the base, his hands moving over the surface with practiced precision. Mila watched as he pressed against a seemingly random sequence of grooves in the rock. "What the hell?" Mila began, but her words died in her throat as the rock shifted, revealing a narrow entrance. Beyond it, faint blue light flickered, casting shadows that danced across the walls. "Come on," Kane said, standing and motioning for her to follow. "It's safe. Relatively." Mila hesitated, her gaze flicking between him and the opening. "Relatively?" she repeated, her tone laced with skepticism. But despite her reservations, she stepped forward, her curiosity outweighing her caution. The passage was narrow and steep, the walls smooth as if carved by something other than natural erosion. The air grew cooler as they descended, the faint hum of unseen machinery growing louder with each step. Mila's heart pounded in her chest, a mix of trepidation and anticipation tightening her throat. "Kane," she said, her voice echoing softly, "what is this place?" He stopped abruptly as the passage opened into a vast chamber, the light intensifying to reveal a scene that stole Mila's breath. The walls were lined with consoles and displays, their surfaces covered in alien symbols that pulsed faintly with light. At the center of the chamber stood a series of cylindrical structures, their glass-like surfaces glowing with the same ethereal energy that had surrounded the core. The hum of the machinery was louder here, a steady rhythm that seemed to pulse in time with her own heartbeat. Mila stepped forward, her eyes wide as she took in the scene. This is a lab," she said, her voice trembling with awe, "or something like it." Kane didn't respond, his gaze fixed on one of the consoles. He moved toward it, his hands brushing over the surface as though searching for something. Mila followed, her curiosity overriding her unease. "What is all this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Kane didn't answer immediately, his gaze scanning the room with a tension that made her chest tighten. She followed his line of sight to the glowing cylinders at the room's center, their surfaces faintly etched with symbols that mirrored those from the core. The hum of the machinery around them felt darker now, more sinister, as though the energy pulsing through the room was being forced into submission. "This isn't just a lab," Kane said finally, his voice low and grim. "It's something else." Mila stepped closer to one of the consoles, her breath catching as she saw the schematics glowing faintly on its surface. The symbols were overlaid with diagrams, blueprints for something massive, something she didn't fully understand. "Kane," she said slowly, "this place, it's not just studying the core's energy. It's using it, harnessing it." Kane nodded, his jaw tightening. "I think they're building a weapon," he said, his tone steady but heavy with unease. Mila's stomach churned as the weight of his words sank in. She glanced around the chamber, her eyes catching on the faint scorch marks on the floor, the scattered tools and half-disassembled equipment. The facility was abandoned, but not long ago. Whoever had been here had left in a hurry, but not before laying the groundwork for something devastating. Kane stepped beside her, his expression grim. "It's recent," he said, motioning to a half-empty supply crate near the wall. "Days, maybe weeks. Whoever they are, they left in a hurry, but they'll be back." Mila nodded. She turned back to the console, her fingers brushing over the glowing symbols as she tried to make sense of the data. The schematics on the screen flickered, revealing fragments of text in a language she didn't recognize. But one name stood out, etched repeatedly across the diagrams: Pharion Syndicate. "Pharion Syndicate," Mila murmured, her brow furrowing. She glanced at Kane, who stiffened at the mention of the name. "You've heard of them?" she asked. Kane hesitated, his gaze darkening. "They're a rogue faction," he said finally, his voice low. "Off-world, dangerous. They don't answer to any of the major houses, and they don't follow the treaties. If they've been here—" He trailed off. "They'll do whatever it takes to finish what they started," Mila finished for him. The thought of the core's energy being weaponized, of its balance being broken, made her stomach churn. This wasn't just about Zephros anymore. It was bigger than the planet, bigger than her mission. And it wasn't over. Mila turned back to the glowing cylinders, her thoughts racing. The energy they emitted was unstable, raw, as though the planet itself was resisting their attempts to control it. "They're not just harnessing the core," she said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. "They're breaking it." Kane nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the schematics. "And if they succeed," he said quietly, "it won't just destroy this planet. It'll spread." Mila stared at the glowing cylinders, their flickering light casting shifting shadows across the chamber. She didn't know how much time they had, but one thing was clear. They couldn't leave this place intact. The Pharion Syndicate's work had to be stopped, and the core's balance had to be protected before it was too late. She took a steadying breath and finally spoke. "We're in way over our heads," she said, her voice taut. "This isn't something we can handle on our own. I need to call in backup, reinforcements from the Order." Kane stiffened immediately, turning toward her with a sharpness that made her pause. "No chance," he said. "You send a signal, and it's over. Someone will be listening, monitoring for any kind of radio wave or transmission. They'll track us in minutes. Mila frowned, her frustration bubbling to the surface. This isn't up to us anymore, Kane, she snapped. This operation was sanctioned by the Order, and I have my orders. So do you. I don't trust the Order, he said, his voice darker now, carrying an undercurrent of something raw. You think they're any better than the Pharion Syndicate? I've seen how these factions operate. They're all the same. They'll take the core and weaponize it just like the Syndicate would. Mila stared at him, taken aback by the vehemence in his tone. You're a contractor, she said firmly, her gaze locking onto his. You serve the Order. That's the job you signed up for. Kane let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. I've had many lives before this one, Mila, he said, his voice softer but still laced with bitterness. I've served many people, many factions. Trust me when I say this. Loyalty is just a transaction to them. They don't care about the core, about balance, or even about you. They care about power. Mila tightened her grip on the scanner, her chest tightening as the weight of his words settled in. She didn't want to believe him, but a part of her couldn't ignore the truth in what he said. Still, she refused to let his cynicism dictate their next move. We'll debate this later, she said finally. Right now, we're here. And as long as we're here, we might as well take a closer look. Kane nodded. Fine, he said, but we move fast. I don't like how quiet it is here. They moved deeper into the lab, the corridors growing narrower and darker as they descended. The glow of the faintly pulsing cylinders from earlier gave way to shadowy alcoves and dimly lit passages. Mila's eyes darted around the space, her unease growing with each step. This place feels wrong, she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Kane didn't respond, his attention fixed ahead. They rounded a corner, and Mila's breath caught as they entered a large chamber. At the center stood a device unlike anything she had ever seen. It was massive and intricate, its surface bristling with unfamiliar appendages and angular structures. The energy emanating from it was faint, but unsettling, like a predator waiting to pounce. What the hell is that? Mila whispered. Before Kane could answer, a soft, whirring sound cut through the air, and Mila's blood ran cold. She turned sharply, her eyes widening as a small, needle-like drone zipped out from an alcove. Hunter-seekers, Kane said. Get down. Mila dropped to the floor just as the drone shot past her, its thin, metallic body slicing through the air with terrifying precision. She rolled to the side, her heart pounding as Kane drew his weapon and fired a sharp burst. The drone exploded in a shower of sparks, but the noise echoed through the chamber, amplifying the tension. There'll be more, Kane said urgently, pulling Mila to her feet. They sprinted across the chamber, ducking behind machinery as more drones emerged from hidden alcoves. Mila's chest burned with exertion, her pulse pounding in her ears. They reached the far side of the room and slipped through a narrow doorway just as another drone zipped past, its needle-like appendages glinting menacingly. The next corridor was cluttered with debris, papers, shattered equipment, and fragments of consoles strewn across the floor. Mila knelt and sifted through the mess, her hands trembling as she uncovered a pile of documents. Her breath hitched as she scanned the faded text and fragmented diagrams. Kane, she called. Look at this. Kane crouched beside her, his eyes narrowing as he examined the papers. The diagrams were crude but clear, a series of maps and coordinates converging on a single point deep within Zephros' terrain. "It's the core," Mila said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They've been looking for the core's source. That's what this is all about." Kane's gaze darkened, his jaw tightening. "And they're close," he said grimly. "Closer than we are." Mila stuffed the documents into her pack. The Pharion Syndicate wasn't just experimenting with the core, they were trying to control it at its source, and if they succeeded, it would mean disaster, not just for Zephros but for the galaxy. She stood, her resolve hardening. "We have to find it first," she said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. "Before they do." Kane nodded, his expression serious. "Then we'd better move fast." They rounded a corner, and the corridor opened into a cavernous expanse. Mila halted, her eyes widening at the sight before her. The walls were studded with intricate mineral formations, their surfaces gleaming faintly under an otherworldly glow. The space felt alive, not with motion but with an uncanny stillness that carried weight, as if the air itself held secrets. "This wasn't on the map," Kane said, his voice dropping as he stepped forward. His eyes darted over the strange terrain, trying to piece together its purpose. "What is this place?" Mila remained silent, her attention pulled toward an almost imperceptible path cutting through the formations. The way ahead wasn't clear. It felt more like a suggestion than a trail, one that her instincts urged her to follow. She glanced down at her scanner, frowning as its display jittered with readings that didn't make sense. "The energy levels here are off," she murmured. "It's like they're shifting, adapting." Kane crouched beside one of the formations, his expression guarded. "Adaptation or not, someone, or something, designed this." He ran his hand near the surface, pausing before making contact. "And they didn't want just anyone wandering through." Mila felt a strange sensation, not quite a sound nor a touch, but a sense of being watched. She turned sharply, her gaze scanning the shadows that seemed to shift unnaturally at the edges of the room. "Kane," she said quietly, her voice steady but firm. "Do you feel that?" He straightened, his hand instinctively moving toward his weapon. "I feel like we're not alone," he admitted, his tone low but alert. Mila scanned the dim recesses of the cavern, her unease deepening as a faint glimmer caught her attention, an ethereal flicker at the far end of the chamber, barely distinguishable from the shimmering surfaces around it. Without waiting for Kane, she stepped toward it, her boots crunching softly against the uneven ground. "There's something here," she said, her words more to herself than to him. As she drew closer, the glimmer seemed to shift, not in movement but in intensity, as though acknowledging her presence. Kane caught up to her, his hand brushing her arm to slow her pace. "Are you sure about this?" he asked. "No," she admitted, "but we didn't come all this way to turn back." The trail led them through a narrow passage that opened into another chamber, smaller but no less strange. In its center stood what appeared to be an ancient pedestal, worn smooth with time. Symbols covered its surface, their shapes unfamiliar but oddly deliberate. Surrounding it were faint impressions in the ground, as though figures had stood there recently, or had been standing there for a long time, waiting. Mila approached cautiously. Kane lingered a few paces behind, his eyes scanning for threats. The pedestal's symbols seemed to glow faintly as Mila drew closer, their light pulsing in a slow, deliberate rhythm. She reached out a hand, hesitating just before her fingers made contact. "It's them?" she said, The figures. Kane's expression darkened, his skepticism clear. What are you talking about? Mila turned to face him, her gaze unwavering. They've been guiding us, she said. Leading us here. Helping us. Her words hung in the air, carrying an unsettling certainty that made Kane shift uneasily. And what if they're not helping? He asked. What if they're just using us to get what they want? Mila hesitated, her fingers brushing the surface of the pedestal. A sudden rush of warmth spread through her hand, not painful but startling. Images filled her mind, fleeting, fragmented glimpses of a machine far more intricate and massive than the one they'd seen in the lab. Its purpose was unmistakable. A weapon. One designed to shatter the balance Zephros had maintained for centuries. She pulled back, her breath unsteady. They're trying to stop it, she said. The Syndicate, Kane, they're the real threat. The figures, they want to protect the core, not harm it. Kane frowned. And what makes you so sure about that? Mila met his gaze, her expression resolute. Because if they wanted to harm us, she said, they would have already. The trail narrowed as Mila and Kane pressed forward, the strange formations around them shifting into jagged, angular patterns that seemed almost purposeful. Subtle signs marked their path, an unusual rock formation here, a faintly glowing symbol etched into a stone there. Mila didn't know if it was the figures or the planet itself guiding them, but the further they went, the clearer the way seemed. We're getting close, Mila said. Her scanner flickered in her hand, its readings erratic but steadily pointing forward. She felt the weight of their journey pressing down on her, but a flicker of determination pushed her onward. Kane nodded but remained silent. The path opened slightly, the confined tunnel giving way to a wide, sloping ravine that stretched toward open air. The atmosphere was heavier here. She paused, glancing at Kane. Do you feel that? She asked. Yeah, he replied, his tone guarded. Feels like the air's thicker. We're leaving the subterranean layers. It's probably tied to the core's source. They stepped into the open, the landscape a barren expanse of rock and shifting sands. The sky above was dark and heavy, Zephros' perpetual clouds churning in slow, ominous patterns. Then they heard it, a low, steady thrum that grew louder by the second. Mila froze. What's that? She whispered. Kane's posture shifted instantly, his hand resting on his weapon. Get down, he ordered. They darted behind a jagged outcropping of rock, pressing themselves against its surface as the noise intensified. Mila peered cautiously around the edge, her breath catching as a small, sleek ship shot across the sky above them. The craft was angular, its design sharp and utilitarian. Its engines left faint trails of vapor in its wake as it sped past, banking sharply before disappearing over a ridge. Mila's stomach churned as she caught a glimpse of its markings, bold, streaked colors painted across its hull in an unfamiliar pattern. It's a Strivak R-14, fast, maneuverable, used mostly for reconnaissance. Reconnaissance? By who? Pharion Syndicate, he said, his voice low. They've got a whole fleet of those things, but the colors, those markings, they don't match their standard. Then who does it belong to? Mila asked, her voice edged with urgency. Kane shook his head, his eyes fixed on the ridge where the ship had disappeared. Could be a rogue unit, or maybe they're trying to disguise their presence. Mila leaned back against the rock, her mind racing. If the Syndicate was this close, It meant their search for the core's source wasn't as secretive as she'd hoped. "They're on our trail," she said quietly. "But we're not going to outrun them if they're using ships like that. We'll need to stay out of sight." Mila glanced at him, her gaze firm. "Then let's make sure we find the core first." Kane didn't respond immediately, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, a mix of determination and unease. "Stay close," he said finally, "and keep your scanner quiet. We can't risk giving away our position." As they slipped back into the shadows of the ravine, as Mila and Kane moved swiftly through the uneven terrain, her legs burned from the relentless pace. Her mind started to drift. A memory pressed against her thoughts, unbidden but vivid, like a wound reopened. She could see herself again. A small girl sitting in the shadows of the orphanage's courtyard, clutching her knees to her chest. It had been a quiet morning, the kind she usually enjoyed. The men and women in the Order's sharp uniforms had appeared out of nowhere, their boots clinking against the cobblestones as they strode toward the orphanage head's office. Mila had been curious at first, her gaze following their movements from behind the faded curtain of the dormitory. But as the figures disappeared inside, a strange unease settled over her. She crept closer, her bare feet silent against the worn stone, and pressed her ear to the cracked doorframe of their headmistress's office. The orphanage head, a wiry woman with a perpetually sour expression, was speaking in hushed tones. "She's just a child. I don't see how she could be what you're looking for." "You don't need to understand," came a woman's sharp reply. Mila recognized the voice immediately. It belonged to Inara, though she didn't yet know the name. "The Order doesn't recruit on whims. The girl has potential." There was a pause, and Mila's heart thudded in her chest as she strained to hear more. Another voice, low and commanding, joined the conversation. "We've seen the reports. Her instincts, her awareness. It's not natural. She belongs with us." The orphanage head cleared her throat nervously. "And if she refuses?" Inara's voice was colder now, edged with something Mila couldn't quite name. "Refusal is not an option," she said. "You've seen what happens to those who squander such gifts. The galaxy doesn't wait for anyone, not even a child." "She'll be given a choice," the commanding voice added, its tone softer but no less firm. "But she will choose us. They always do." The present crashed back in, catching herself just before falling. Kane turned, his brow furrowing as he reached out to steady her. He studied her for a moment before nodding, his attention shifting back to the path ahead. Mila exhaled slowly, her thoughts still tangled in the memory. That day had marked the beginning of everything, the start of her training, her missions, and her place within the Order. But it had also left her with questions that had never been answered. As they continued toward the core's source, Mila couldn't shake the voices from her mind. The Order had taken her in, trained her, made her what she was. But at what cost? Was this the moment they saw coming? They descended cautiously from the ridge, the rocky path giving way to a flatter expanse scattered with debris and weathered formations. Mila called for a halt as they reached a sheltered alcove, the jagged overhang offering a moment of respite from the biting wind. She set the data pad on a flat stone, her fingers working quickly to bring up the map's fragmented display. The glow illuminated both their faces, casting long shadows on the stone walls. Kane crouched beside her, his eyes darting between the screen and their surroundings. "These coordinates line up," he said, pointing to a marked section near the center of the map. "We're here." And the core's source should be just beyond this basin. Mila nodded but frowned as she studied the datapad. It's not a straight path, she muttered, tracing the jagged lines with her finger. These ridges are natural choke points, perfect for an ambush. Kane leaned closer, his presence casting a shadow over the map. The Syndicate would have scouted this terrain months ago, he said. They'll be waiting for us to make a mistake. Mila glanced at him, her expression pensive. If they already know where the core is, why haven't they taken it? She asked. What are they waiting for? Could be they're still figuring out how to harness it, or waiting for some sort of key, he said. Energy like that, it's not easy to control. Mila narrowed her eyes, sensing an edge to his words she couldn't quite place. You sound like you've seen something like this before, she said. Kane hesitated, his gaze shifting back to the datapad. Not exactly, he said, his tone almost too casual. Just heard stories? Every faction in the galaxy has their myths about untapped power. Mila didn't respond immediately, her mind turning over his words. Something about the way he said myths felt off, like he was deflecting. And what's your take? She asked after a beat, keeping her tone light. Kane shrugged, his eyes fixed on the map. My take is that we're wasting time sitting here, he said, standing abruptly. Mila watched him for a moment. There it was again. A hesitation, a slight crack in his usually impenetrable demeanor. He wasn't telling her everything. She tucked the datapad back into her pack and stood, brushing the dust from her hands and, You're right, she said, keeping her voice neutral. But we can't afford any surprises, Kane. Not from the Syndicate, not from this planet, and not from each other. Kane froze for a fraction of a second, his back to her, before nodding. Agreed, he said. He started toward the path ahead. Let's go. As they stepped back into the open, the oppressive wind seemed to grow louder, carrying with it a sense of foreboding. Mila tightened her grip on her pack, her eyes on Kane's back. If there was more to his story, she would find out. She had to. They made their way to the basin. Every step closer to the core's source seemed to amplify the unnatural stillness around them, the only sound their boots crunching against the sand. Then Kane stopped abruptly, raising a hand to halt her. Look, he said, his voice low. Mila followed his gaze to a dark shape half buried in the shifting sand ahead. At first glance, it seemed like another piece of debris left behind by the Syndicate, but as they approached, its silhouette became clearer. It was a suit, humanoid in form, but unmistakably alien in its design. The armored plates were sleek yet robust, curving seamlessly around the joints. Its chest bore the same bold streaks of color they'd seen on the ship earlier, though now they were faded and worn, dulled by exposure to the elements. The suit's surface was scarred, as though it had been through a violent skirmish. Its left arm was twisted unnaturally, the plating along its forearm shattered to reveal intricate internal mechanisms. Mila crouched beside it, her fingers brushing away the sand to uncover a faint emblem etched into the chest, a sigil she didn't recognize, sharp and angular, like interlocking blades. This isn't standard Syndicate gear, she murmured, her eyes narrowing as she studied the suit's details. Look at the design. It's too advanced. And this emblem, it doesn't match any faction I've seen. Kane knelt beside her, his expression grim. The tech's old, he said, tapping a segment of the suit's visor. But not ancient. Whoever was using this, they weren't just Syndicate scouts. This is reconnaissance-grade armor, built for high-risk exploration. Mila tilted her head, her gaze falling on a small device embedded in the suit's wrist. Its casing was cracked, but faint lights blinked weakly, as if still clinging to life. "It's still functional," she said, pulling a small tool from her pack. "Let me see if I can pull anything from it." "Make it fast. I don't like how exposed we are here." Mila worked quickly, her fingers deftly prying open the device's casing. A soft hum emitted from within, followed by a burst of static. The screen flickered, displaying fragmented data logs and blurred visuals. One image caught Mila's attention, a distorted view of the core's source, its jagged silhouette glowing with a harsh white light. The log's text scrolled in an unfamiliar script, but certain segments were annotated in a language she recognized. Energy levels unstable, direct interface fatal, external shielding compromised. Mila read aloud, her voice trailing off as she pieced the fragments together. Her stomach twisted as she realized what it meant. They were trying to access the core directly, and it killed them. Kane leaned closer, his brow furrowing. "Or worse," he said darkly, gesturing to the twisted remains of the suit. "That damage isn't just from exposure. Something hit this guy. Hard." Mila looked up sharply, her heart pounding as she scanned the area. The wind had picked up, swirling the sand around them in chaotic patterns. "Then what did it?" she asked, her voice tense. Before Kane could answer, a deafening roar tore through the air, reverberating off the rocky cliffs. Mila and Kane froze, their gazes snapping toward the source of the sound. The basin ahead shimmered with a blinding light, the ground trembling beneath their feet. Mila squinted, shielding her eyes as the light subsided, revealing the core's source in stark clarity. It was massive, an angular, crystalline structure that jutted from the ground like a fractured spire. Its surface pulsed with an intense, white energy, casting ghostly reflections across the basin. Surrounding it were strange, metallic formations, half buried in the sand like forgotten relics. The air around the core seemed to vibrate with raw power, the energy palpable even from this distance. Kane's hand went instinctively to his weapon, his jaw tightening. "We've found it," he said grimly. Mila stood, her gaze locked on the core. She couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching them, its energy shifting subtly as though aware of their presence. "The suit," she said. "Whoever they were here to protect it, or to use it." Kane glanced back at the remains of the suit. "Either way," he said, "we're walking into the same danger they didn't survive." Mila didn't respond immediately. The suit, the logs, the Syndicate's pursuit, and now the core's silent, ominous presence. "Then let's make sure we're ready," she said finally. Together they turned toward the core, its light bathing them in its unrelenting glow as they stepped into the unknown. Kane pulled out his binoculars, his movements precise as he adjusted the settings to scan the basin surrounding the core's source. The terrain was stark, littered with jagged debris and shadowed crevices, but there was no sign of movement. He swept his gaze across the expanse one last time before lowering the binoculars. "Looks clear," he said, though his tone carried a note of skepticism. "If anyone's here, they're keeping a damn good low profile." Mila leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she studied the scene ahead. The spire-like core loomed at the center of the basin, its harsh light pulsing faintly against the dim landscape. The ruins around it were more distinct now, fragments of angular structures half buried in sand, their surfaces etched with strange markings that seemed to shimmer faintly. "This feels too easy," she muttered. Kane shot her a look. "Easy doesn't mean safe," he said. "But we've come this far. If we don't move now, we'll lose whatever edge we've got." Mila nodded. Together they descended into the basin. The closer they got to the core, the heavier the air felt, thick with an energy that seemed to hum just beyond the edge of perception. The ruins loomed larger now, their sharp lines and intricate carvings creating an unsettling contrast to the natural chaos of the landscape. At the base of the spire, a gaping fissure cut through the ground, spiraling downward into darkness. Kane peered over the edge. "This is our way in," he said. "Stay close. If this goes bad, I'm not carrying you out." Mila smirked faintly despite the tension. "I'll try not to slow you down," she said. They lowered themselves into the fissure, their steps cautious on the uneven ground. The path spiraled downward, the walls narrowing as they descended deeper. The light from the core dimmed, replaced by a faint, bioluminescent glow that emanated from veins of crystalline material embedded in the rock. "Feels like a trap," Kane muttered. "It's not," Mila said quietly, though she wasn't sure where the certainty in her voice came from. She felt an almost magnetic pull toward the bottom of the cave, as though the core itself were guiding her. It wasn't a sensation she trusted, but it was impossible to ignore. The spiral path opened into a vast chamber, its ceiling disappearing into darkness above them. At the center of the room stood the core's base. Around it were remnants of ancient ruins, pillars carved with intricate symbols, shattered statues that seemed almost humanoid, and what looked like the remains of an altar, its surface worn smooth with time. Mila stepped forward, her gaze locked on the core. The energy emanating from it was overwhelming, making her chest tighten and her thoughts scatter. She staggered slightly, catching herself against one of the ruined pillars. The moment her fingers touched the cold stone, her vision blurred, and the world around her dissolved. She was no longer in the chamber. Instead, she stood in a vast, endless expanse of light and shadow, the ground beneath her shifting with every step. The figures were there, not physical forms but silhouettes of light. One of them turned toward her, its presence filling her mind with a voice that was not a voice, a riddle spoken in echoes. "To break the fracture, you must mend the seam. The key lies not in what is seen, but in what binds the seen and unseen. Balance is the core, yet it must be unbalanced first." The words wrapped around her like a cold wind, their meaning elusive but urgent. Mila's breath quickened as the vision faded, the chamber rushing back into focus around her. Kane was at her side, his expression dark with concern. "Mila," he said sharply, "what happened?" She shook her head, her thoughts still racing. "I saw them. The figures, they spoke to me, or something like speaking." Kane frowned. "And what did they say?" Mila took a deep breath. But then it clicked. A connection she hadn't seen before, a pattern that tied the ruins, the core, and the figures' riddle together. "They were right," she said. "It's not just about balance. It's about disrupting it, just enough to force a reset." Kane's brow furrowed. "Reset what?" he asked warily. Mila turned to him, her expression resolute. "The core, the energy. It's been destabilized for years, but it's not broken. It just needs to be rebalanced, and I know how to do it." The chamber seemed to hum in response to her words, the energy from the core intensifying as though acknowledging her realization. "Then let's hope your vision wasn't lying," he said darkly. "Because if you're wrong, we're all dead." Mila stepped closer to the core. The symbols etched into the ruins around her seemed to align in her mind, their meaning snapping into place like pieces of a puzzle she didn't know she'd been solving. She crouched down, pulling out her portable computer and connecting the scanner. The device's screen came to life, displaying the chaotic data she'd collected throughout their journey. The electromagnetic spikes, the energy distortions, the mysterious frequencies that the core emitted in rhythmic pulses. Her fingers flew across the interface, her mind racing as she began to piece together a solution. "It's a spectrum shift," she muttered, half to herself. "The core's energy isn't static. It's fluctuating between states, destabilized because it's out of sync. If I can calculate the harmonic median—" Kane, standing a few paces behind her, kept his gaze fixed on the chamber's perimeter. His posture was tense, his hand resting near his weapon as though expecting trouble. "Can you fix it?" he asked, his tone clipped. Mila barely heard him, her focus locked on the data streaming across her screen. "Not fix it," she said. "If I can align the frequencies, the core will stabilize. But it's like trying to tune an instrument that keeps changing its pitch." She paused, her brow furrowing as a new realization hit her. "Wait," she murmured, her eyes widening. "The core isn't just shifting, it's responding. To us. To me." "What does that mean?" Kane asked sharply, stepping closer. "It means—" Mila hesitated, the weight of her discovery sinking in. "It's reacting to input, and if I can synchronize with its oscillations, I can reset its balance without overloading it." She pulled up an algorithm on her screen, quickly inputting the core's fluctuating data. The computer struggled to process the sheer volume of information, the screen flickering as it worked to calculate the precise sequence of adjustments needed. Mila bit her lip, her fingers trembling as she initiated the program. "This will take a minute," she said, glancing back at Kane. "But it should work." She turned her attention back to the computer, her breath catching as the algorithm began to overlay the core's frequencies, aligning them into a coherent pattern. It was working. She could feel it. A subtle shift in the air, as though the chamber itself was exhaling in relief. But then something shifted behind her. Before she could react, an arm wrapped tightly around her shoulders, pulling her backward with brutal force. Mila's computer clattered to the ground, the screen flickering as it spun out of her reach. She gasped, struggling against the grip. But Kane's strength was unyielding. "What are you doing?" she demanded, her voice sharp with confusion and anger. Kane's voice was low and mocking, a tone she'd never heard from him before. "Thank you, Mila," he said, his breath warm against her ear. "For all your hard work. You've made this so much easier than I expected." Mila froze. "Kane," she said, her voice trembling. "What are you talking about? Let me go." But he didn't release her. Instead, he tightened his grip, his other hand deftly reaching for her scanner and tucking it into his pack. "You always were the sharp one," he continued, his tone almost patronizing. "Always asking the right questions, always just a step ahead. But not this time." Mila's heart raced, her confusion giving way to fury. "You're with them," she said, the words laced with disbelief. The Syndicate. All this time you've been working for them. Kane chuckled, a sound that sent a chill down her spine. Not quite, he said, but let's just say I've got other interests. And now, thanks to you, I have everything I need. Mila thrashed against him. Kane, she said, her voice sharp and desperate. You don't understand what you're doing. If the core destabilizes... I understand perfectly, he interrupted, his tone cold. And I suggest you save your breath. It won't matter soon enough. The chamber's light pulsed erratically, the core seeming to react to the chaos unfolding around it. Mila's eyes sodded toward her computer, the program still running, its screen glowing faintly where it lay on the ground. She knew she had to act, but Kane's grip was like iron, his intentions clear. Why? She demanded. How could you? Kane hesitated for a fraction of a second, his grip faltering just enough for Mila to sense a flicker of something. Regret. Or perhaps hesitation. But it passed as quickly as it came, replaced by the sudden movement of Kane's hand to his communicator. With a quick press of the button, his voice cut through the rising hum of the core's energy. The target has been secured. Send in the team. What the hell are you doing? She hissed, her voice low but charged with fury. Her struggles intensified, but his grip remained unyielding. Just doing my job, Kane said coolly. And, as it turns out, you've done yours all too well. Before Mila could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the chamber, accompanied by the faint mechanical whir of descending cables. She twisted her head toward the fissure they'd entered through, her heart sinking as shadows began to drop into view. Syndicate troopers, their armor sleek and polished, their weapons glinting faintly in the core's pulsing light. One by one, they landed with precision. Each trooper carried the unmistakable authority of soldiers trained for high-stakes operations. Mila's stomach churned as the largest of them detached from his rappel line, his boots hitting the ground with a resounding thud. His presence was commanding, his armor adorned with intricate markings that set him apart from the rest. He removed his helmet, revealing a sharp, calculating face framed by close-cropped hair. His eyes, cold and piercing, locked onto Mila before shifting to Kane. Well done, Marshal, the man said, his voice smooth but laced with authority. I expected nothing less. Kane released Mila, stepping back with a sharp salute. Thank you, Commander Tavor, he said, his tone clipped and professional. Mila staggered slightly, her hands instinctively moving to her pack, but a trooper leveled a weapon at her, halting her in place. Marshal? She spat, her voice trembling with anger. Your syndicate? Kane glanced at her, his expression unreadable. It's complicated, he said simply, turning back to Tavor. Complicated? Mila said. You lied to me. You used me. Tavor smirked faintly, stepping closer to Mila with an air of amusement. You're a sharp one. I'll give you that, he said, his tone almost mocking. But you should have seen this coming. The good Marshal here has always been loyal to the highest bidder. Mila's gaze darted between him and Tavor. The core's energy isn't stable, she said, her voice cutting through the tension. If you try to extract it without recalibrating, we know, Tavor interrupted, his tone sharp. That's why you're here. Your work on aligning the frequencies was impressive. He gestured toward one of the troopers who moved to retrieve Mila's fallen computer. But you've done enough. We'll take it from here. Mila's fists clenched, her fury bubbling to the surface. You don't understand, she said. Enough, Tavor snapped. He turned to Kane. Marshal, get rid of her. We can't have any interference. Kane hesitated for the briefest of moments, his gaze flickering to Mila. For a fleeting second, she thought she saw something in his expression. Regret, doubt, maybe even guilt. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. He stepped forward, his hand gripping her arm firmly as he restrained her. Kane, Mila said, her voice low and desperate. Don't do this. You know what they're planning. You know what this will do. His grip tightened. It's not up to me, honey, he said, his tone cold but hollow. Tavor's smirk deepened as he watched the exchange, clearly enjoying the dynamic. Begin preparations for the extraction. Mila's heart pounded as she watched the troopers move toward the core, their equipment gleaming ominously in the shifting light. She knew she had to act, but Kane's grip and the surrounding soldiers left her options painfully limited. Marshal, didn't I say get rid of her? What are you waiting for, a goodbye kiss or something? The commander said. That was not in the rules of engagement, Kane replied. Ha! You hired hands are soft. There are no rules of engagement on Zephros, the commander said as he walked towards Mila. She saw nothing but malice on his face. She called out, Please, you don't understand the power you are trying to harness. He looked both ways as he swung his rifle off his shoulder. Of course I do, sweetheart. With that, he swiftly struck her in the temple of her mask with the butt of his rifle. Her body went limp and crumbled onto the rocky ground. The veins in Kane's red face were bulging. He spat at the commander. You had no reason. She's half your size. A binding restraint would have been sufficient. Tavor laughed. He wheeled around and said, Come on, boys. Let's finish the job and get off this god-forsaken planet. Mila's eyelids fluttered open as a resounding crash rattled the ground beneath her, sending a jolt through her aching body. Her vision swam, shapes and colors blending into an unsteady blur. The sharp scent of scorched air filled her nostrils, and a low ringing thrummed in her ears, muting the chaos unfolding around her. She blinked hard, her surroundings sharpening you just enough to see a figure, armored and motionless, collapse to the ground a few feet away. The lifeless trooper's weapon lay inches from his limp hand, and the once pristine armor was scorched and dented as though struck by an unseen force. Blood seeped into the sand, pooling around her hand as she instinctively recoiled. The noise around her came into focus. Sharp bursts of rifle fire, the barked commands of syndicate troopers, and the strange, otherworldly sound of something slamming through the air with incredible power. Mila rolled onto her side, her head spinning as she pushed herself up on trembling arms. Her hand brushed against the coarse sand beneath her, and she instinctively shuddered as another trooper toppled beside her like a rag doll, a dull thud sending vibrations through the ground. Her breath labored as she glimpsed his visor, cracked and lifeless, reflecting faint flashes of light from the skirmish above. She forced herself upright, her heart pounding as the scene around her came into focus. Bright streaks from syndicate rifles rebounded through the dim chamber, illuminating ghostly figures moving along the edges of the basin. The cloaked beings moved as though they were part of the shadows themselves, their flowing forms flickering in and out of the line of fire. One raised an arm, and a surge of energy rippled through the air, striking a trooper with devastating force and sending him flying against the jagged ruins. Another gestured sharply, and the debris scattered across the basin seemed to spring to life, hurtling toward the syndicate's ranks like shrapnel. The air buzzed with tension, and Mila felt it pressing against her chest like an invisible weight. She shrank back into the partial cover of the ruins, The cloaked figures, whatever they were, had turned the basin into a battlefield. Troopers shouted in frantic bursts, their once disciplined formations breaking as they scrambled for cover, firing wildly at the figures whose attacks they couldn't predict. It was chaos, and in that chaos, Mila saw her chance. She turned her head just enough to spot her computer lying half buried in the sand where it had fallen. The screen still flickered faintly, the algorithm she'd initiated earlier running uninterrupted, and she dragged herself toward it, keeping low to avoid the crossfire. Her fingers closed around the device, and she clutched it tightly, its cold surface grounding her in the storm of noise and fear. Above her, a cloaked figure sent a wave of energy crashing into a syndicate trooper, his body slamming into the rock with a lethal force. The commander's voice boomed through the chaos, issuing orders to regroup, but his words were drowned out by the deafening roar of an energy blast colliding with the far wall. The core itself seemed to react to the disturbance, its light flickering erratically and casting long, distorted shadows that danced across the ruins. A flash of light drew her attention, and she turned just in time to see a trooper tossed aside like a discarded doll. His rifle clattered to the ground, spinning uselessly before coming to rest mere feet from where Mila crouched. The figures were doing their job, keeping the syndicate occupied. If she was going to escape, this was her moment. Her gaze darted to the spiral path leading out of the basin. It was clear, but the distance between her and the exit felt impossibly vast amidst the chaos. She slammed the computer shut and shifted her weight, readying herself to sprint. But before she could move, a burst of energy struck the pillar beside her, sending shards of stone raining down. She threw up her arm, shielding her face as the debris settled. Now was her moment. She crawled over to grab the rifle, her boots skimming over the uneven ground awkwardly. It was heavy, but once she had a decent handle on it, she shot off toward her escape route. Every instinct told her to keep moving, to reach the spiral path and disappear before anyone noticed she was gone. As she reached the edge of the basin, she glanced back just once. The core's light pulsed erratically, casting its eerie glow over the ruins. The cloaked figures were winning, their strikes dismantling the syndicate forces with terrifying precision. Mila's hands gripped the syndicate rifle tightly, the weight of it unfamiliar but reassuring as she sprinted toward the spiral path leading out of the basin. Her breath came in short gasps, each step jarring her already aching body, but she pushed forward. The chamber's noise, shouts, gunfire, and the eerie hum of the core faded behind her, replaced by the rapid pounding of her boots against the uneven ground. The core's energy, the cloaked figures, Kane's betrayal, it all swirled together, a storm of unanswered questions and raw emotions. Why was Kane working with them? How long had he been lying? She swallowed hard, her jaw tightening as she shoved those thoughts aside. Survival came first. Answers could wait. The winding path narrowed, the jagged walls pressing in as she descended. If the syndicate had deployed their troopers here, they would have brought more ships. This would be her ticket off Zephros. Fast. The idea wasn't without risk. Syndicate ships were heavily secured, and stealing one would be no small feat. But it was her best option, and Mila had never been one to back away from the impossible. She adjusted her grip on the rifle, her eyes darting between the path ahead and the faint glow of the chamber behind her. Stay focused, she told herself, willing the tension in her chest to subside. One step at a time. The path twisted sharply, opening into a broader tunnel where the air grew cooler, laced with the faint tang of ozone. But then the silence shattered. A sudden, blinding flash lit the tunnel, and a deafening explosion sent her sprawling to the ground. A jagged rock nearby disintegrated into shards, pelting her with debris as she scrambled for cover. She pressed herself against the tunnel wall, her breath coming in ragged gasps. A familiar voice cut through the haze of dust and ringing in her ears. "I warned you, Mila. Running only delays the inevitable." Mila's stomach twisted as Kane stepped into view, his rifle trained on her. His silhouette was framed by the faint glow of the core's light behind him, casting his face in shadow. But she could hear the smirk in his voice, sharp and mocking. She gritted her teeth, her grip tightening on her own weapon. "Kane," she spat, her voice thick with anger. "Why are you doing this? What do you even stand to gain?" Kane tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "It's not about gain," he said simply, "and it's about playing the right side. And you've been playing for the wrong one, Mila. All this time, and you never saw it." Her chest heaved as she stared at him. The rifle in her hands felt both too heavy and too light, her muscles taut as she calculated the distance between them. He spoke, his voice low and laced with urgency. "You don't understand, Mila. You have no idea who you're really up against." She let out a bitter laugh, her knuckles white around the rifle. "The Pharion Syndicate? Those scavengers couldn't find their way out of a supply closet without their fancy tech. Hardly terrifying." Kane's expression darkened, and he took a step forward, his voice cutting her off like a blade. "Pharion is nothing more than a pawn in a much larger game. The players involved, they operate on levels you can't even begin to imagine." Mila forced herself to meet his gaze, defiance flickering in her eyes. "Then why are you working for them? Why betray everything we've done to play errand boy for people you clearly despise?" "This isn't about betrayal," he said quietly. "It's survival. And right now you're holding on to something that will get you killed faster than you can blink. Give it up, Mila. The data, the scanner, all of it. Hand it over and walk away. If you run now, you might have a slim chance of getting off this planet alive." Mila stared at him. His words carried no malice, only an urgency that was more unsettling than any threat. Her voice shaking with anger and disbelief. "You expect me to trust you after all this?" Kane exhaled sharply, his frustration palpable. "Trust me. Don't trust me. It doesn't matter. But if you want to survive, you need to stop thinking you can win this fight. This isn't a battle, Mila. It's a slaughter, and you're in the middle of it." He sounded genuine. Too genuine. But that only made her more suspicious. She took a step back. "Fine," she said firmly, her voice low but resolute. "You can have it. Take it all. I'm done with the games of this planet." Kane's eyes narrowed, suspicion flickering across his face, but he didn't lower his rifle. "Don't try anything, Mila. Just hand it over." With a slow, deliberate motion, Mila lifted the computer and scanner from her chest, holding them out in front of her. Her hands trembled slightly. "Here," she said, her voice dripping with resignation. "Take it." She moved as if to toss the devices to him, her arms swinging in a wide arc before she shifted her aim subtly and hurled them past him instead. The computer and scanner clattered against the rock face behind Kane, the sound echoing in the narrow tunnel. His head snapped around instinctively. In that split second, Mila seized her chance. She raised her rifle and fired, the sharp report echoing through the chamber as the blast struck the rock face just above where the devices had landed. The impact sent a shower of dust and debris cascading down, the unstable wall collapsing in on itself with a resounding crash. A thick cloud of stone and sand erupted between Mila and Kane, obscuring him from view. Kane shouted something, words lost in the roar of falling rock. But Mila didn't wait to hear what it was. She turned and sprinted down the winding path, her boots pounding against the ground. The air was thick with dust, stinging her eyes and clogging her throat. But she pushed through. Move, Mila, move. The thought pulsed in her mind, louder than the sound of her own labored breathing. She didn't look back, didn't dare to. Every instinct told her that Kane would recover quickly, and when he did, he would come after her. The path opened up ahead, the faint glow of the surface visible through the haze. The landing zone, her singular focus. If the Syndicate had brought ships, she needed to find one, and fast. A Strivac-class scout ship was her best bet. Small, fast, and agile enough to evade pursuit. The air of the surface hit her like a slap as she emerged from the tunnel, her lungs burning as she gulped it in. The faint hum of an engine reached her ears, and she skidded to a halt. The landing zone was still a few hundred meters away, just beyond the ridge, and she could make out the silhouettes of ships clustered there. Sleek and imposing against the dusky sky, she crept her way slowly and silently to the closest ship. Kane crawls out of the rubble, his mouth full of acrid sand and blood. He grabs the computer and frantically brushes off the dust. It felt lighter than usual, and his suspicion proves to be correct as he rotates it and finds the data ports were empty. He growls something inaudible and spits a mixture blood and sand on the ground. She's clever, he'll give her that, but that won't be a sufficient excuse for his boss, or his boss's boss. He tosses the computer aside and scrambles over the mess of rocks. He takes off at a sprint, determined to serve the justice owed to ex-partner. Meanwhile, Mila pressed herself against the cold, matte surface of the scout ship's hull, her movements silent as she crept up the loading ramp. The Strivac was sleek and compact, its angular design almost predatory, with dark plating that reflected only the faintest glimmers of the surrounding lights. The purr of its idle systems thrummed faintly through the ramp beneath her boots, a low vibration that told her the ship was in standby mode, ready to be activated at a moment's notice. Her rifle was steady in her hands as she slipped into the narrow corridor leading toward the cockpit. Red and amber lights pulsed gently along the walls, illuminating her path. The ship's interior was utilitarian, functional and stripped of excess. Cables snaked along the ceiling and small panels dotted the walls, each labeled with cryptic numbers and symbols. She paused as she neared the cockpit, her eyes catching the faint glow of a display screen flickering from within. The sound of soft, uneven breathing reached her ears, and she eased forward, keeping her movements fluid. The pilot was slouched in his chair, his head tilted back against the headrest. His uniform was a mismatch of Syndicate contractor gear. Scuffed boots, a worn vest with faded insignias, and a patch sewn onto his sleeve depicting some unknown mercenary group. A half-empty mug of stim drink rested precariously on the console beside him, its contents sloshing slightly with the vibrations of the ship. Mila's gaze swept over the cockpit, taking in the array of controls and displays. The panels were a maze of glowing buttons, sliders, and screens. Readouts scrolled across the central console, showing status updates for fuel reserves, thruster readiness, and hull integrity. Overhead, a series of toggles flickered, labeled in sharp, angular script that hinted at the ship's off-world origin. She stepped closer, her boots silent against the grated flooring. The rifle in her hands moved steadily upward until its barrel gently pressed against the back of the pilot's head. He gasped, his eyes snapping open as the cold steel registered against his skin, his gaze darting to the reflection of her silhouette in the polished surface of the forward console. "Don't move," Mila said, her voice low but laced with a calm intensity that brooked no argument. "Hands on the controls. Now." The pilot stiffened, his fingers trembling slightly as he lifted them to the console. His voice cracked as he stammered, "Please, I'm just a contractor. I didn't sign up for—" "Save it," Mila interrupted, her tone sharp. "Prime the boosters and prep the ship for takeoff. And don't even think about hitting the comms. One wrong move and I'll make sure this ship needs a new pilot." He swallowed hard, his head nodding rapidly as his hands moved over the controls. Mila kept her rifle trained on him, her eyes flicking to the displays as he worked. The cockpit whirred to life, the overhead lights brightening as the ship's systems engaged. Panels flashed with readouts, and the faint sound of engines spooling up vibrated through the cabin. The pilot's hands moved deftly, flipping switches and adjusting levers with practiced efficiency. "Boosters primed," he said quickly, his voice tight. "Fuel stabilizers are online. Core drives are spooling up now. We're ready to lift off in 30 seconds. "Good," Mila said. "Now, unbuckle that harness and get out of my chair." The pilot hesitated, his gaze darting to the controls. "If I leave, the ship—" "Will still fly," Mila snapped. "Move." He didn't argue further, fumbling with the release on his harness before slowly standing. Mila stepped back just enough to let him shuffle past her, her rifle following his every movement. He slumped against the wall, his hands raised in surrender as he pressed himself into the corner of the cockpit. Mila slid into the pilot's seat, her fingers moving instinctively over the controls. The ship responded with a smooth efficiency that sent a small surge of relief through her. "Put your hands above your head and walk off the ramp," she barked at the pilot. "Keep walking in a straight line and count to 100. If you so much as turn your shoulder—" She didn't have to finish the sentence. The sweat streaming down his forehead and his faint whimpering made it clear that the pilot understood clearly. Turning back to the controls, she adjusted the thrusters, her eyes scanning the displays as the ship's systems confirmed readiness. Outside, the ramp began to retract. Years of training with the Order surged to the forefront of Mila's mind. While every ship had its quirks, some requiring precise calibration of their thrust vectors, others responding sluggishly to input, she'd been drilled in adaptability. The Order's doctrine had been clear: a ship was only as effective as its pilot, and survival often depended on mastering whatever craft was at hand. From bulky freighters to nimble recon vessels, Mila had logged countless hours in simulators and real cockpits alike, learning to read the language of engines and instruments. The ship shuddered slightly as the landing gear disengaged, and Mila allowed herself the faintest flicker of satisfaction. Her line of sight was minimal, as the boosters scattered sand and dust in a massive plume that engulfed the ship. Mila leaned forward, her fingers dancing over the navigation console as she brought up the galactic coordinate system. A three-dimensional grid flickered to life on the main display, glowing faintly with intersecting lines that mapped out the surrounding sectors of space. She keyed in the order's access code, a sequence that would bypass the Syndicate's Overwatch beacons, and waited as the system decrypted her entry. The console responded with a soft chime, and a single set of coordinates appeared on the screen. Sector Epsilon 417, Subvector Delta Prime, Singularity Cluster 239F. Mila's lips pressed into a thin line as she confirmed the destination. The Order's planet, Vidra Prime, wasn't marked on any conventional charts, its location shielded within a dense constellation of asteroids and fractured moons. The cluster, known colloquially as the coronal scatterfield, was treacherous for all but the most skilled pilots. Most who ventured near only found fragments of the massive celestial debris field. It was a perfect place to hide. A general idea of its location might exist in rumors and legends, but the precise entry vectors were known only to the Order's operatives. She input the exact trajectory manually, bypassing the ship's automated systems to ensure no traceable data was left in its logs. The path curved elegantly across the holographic display. Mila adjusted the final sequence and locked it in with a sharp press of the console. Destination: Vidra Prime, the ship's monotone AI confirmed. Estimated travel time: 8 hours, 43 minutes. The boosters roared beneath her, and the ship began to lift from the surface of Zephros, its frame shuddering as the engines adjusted to the planet's uneven atmosphere. Mila gripped the controls tightly, her eyes flicking between the displays as the scout ship gained altitude. The dust plume churned below, a chaotic storm of sand and debris obscuring the basin from view. The thought crossed her mind that there is no way she will get off this planet without being seen. Someone might already be following her. Kane, the Syndicate, or worse. Vidra Prime wasn't invulnerable. Someone determined enough could brute force the navigation and track her trajectory. But the coronal scatterfield had protected the Order for centuries, its natural defenses far deadlier than any Syndicate armada. If she could just make it into hyperspace, she'd be safe. At least for now. Kane sprinted down the ravine, his boots kicking up loose gravel and sand as he followed Mila's trail. His breathing was labored, but his focus was razor-sharp. Then he heard it, the unmistakable high-pitched whine of Strivac-class engines spooling up. He swore under his breath. She'd taken a ship. As the ravine opened up into the landing zone, his worst fears were confirmed. A massive plume of dust and debris swirled violently around the base of a scout ship hovering just above the surface. The engines screaming, sending waves of turbulence rippling through the surrounding terrain. Kane stopped short, his eyes narrowing against the storm of sand. Kane instinctively raised his rifle, his sights trained on the ship's undercarriage. A single shot to a critical joint could ground the vessel, but then his finger hesitated on the trigger. She had the data. If he took her out now, he might lose the one thing that could salvage the mission. Grinding his teeth, he lowered the rifle. He had to find another way. He sprinted toward the landing zone as he neared swirling chaos. He spotted a man slumped to his knees with his hands clasped over his head. A pilot. He didn't slow as he approached, delivering a sharp kick to the man's side that sent him sprawling to the ground. "Who's on that ship?" Kane barked, his voice cutting through the whine of the engines. The pilot groaned, his hands moving to shield his ribs as he scrambled to answer. "I don't know. I swear. It was a woman. She had a rifle. She made me start it up." Kane scowled, his gaze snapping to the ship hovering just out of reach. He couldn't let her get away, not completely. He needed a way to track her, something she wouldn't immediately disable. His fingers moved to the compartment on his belt, unfastening a latch and retrieving a compact device, a geolocator drone. The drone was no larger than his palm, its dark, smooth surface segmented with faint grooves that hinted at its hidden mechanisms. Kane pressed a small button on its side, and the device came to life with a soft click, its panels unfolding to reveal an array of intricate components. Tiny sensor nodes extended from its shell, and its propulsion unit began to glow. Kane keyed in a sequence on the drone's interface. A holographic display flickered to life above the drone, showing a wireframe model of the ship. He tapped a few more commands, adjusting its tracking parameters. Embed protocol, fuselage, signal dampeners active, GPS relay silent. The drone's internal mechanisms clicked and whirred as it calibrated to his input. Its thruster ports rotated slightly, while its exterior shifted color to match the dust-laden tones of the ship. The design was a marvel of engineering, a stealth hunter-seeker equipped with cloaking capabilities and adapted for geolocating missions, with a microfilament anchor that could burrow deep into a target's structure without compromising integrity. Kane tossed the drone up into the sky. The sleek device zipped toward the vessel, navigating the swirling dust with ease. Kane tracked it with his eyes as it reached the ship's fuselage, adjusting mid-flight to avoid detection by external sensors. The drone circled the craft once before locking onto a small vent panel near the rear engine. It darted forward, its microfilament anchor extending with a faint metallic hiss as it drilled into the surface. In seconds, the device had embedded itself, its exterior seamlessly camouflaged to blend with the ship's hull. The drone's silent relay would feed her coordinates back to him in real time, bypassing any tracking systems she might disable on board. Wherever she was headed, he'd know. The scout ship began to ascend rapidly, its thrusters roaring as it broke free of the landing zone. Kane watched as it rose into the darkened sky, a faint glimmer against the swirling dust. He glanced down at his wristcom, where the drone's interface blinked to life, displaying the ship's trajectory. "The stars won't hide you, Mila," he muttered, a cold smirk tugging at his lips. He watched as the ship turned into a small, orange-colored orb as it climbed higher into the atmosphere. A raspy, booming voice broke his attention. "Let me guess. That's not a shooting star, but your little girlfriend hurtling her way into space using one of my ships," Commander Tavor said. Kane turned around and addressed him. "I'm honestly sad to see that you survived the skirmish back there." Skirmish? Or a freak show? Whatever they were, they left abruptly in the middle of the fight, Commander Tavor said. "My question is, why the hell are you not on a ship trailing her right now?" Kane took a moment to steady his breathing. "She's on her way to the Coronal Scatterfield. It's a suicide mission to go at it alone. You would need a full armada to even remotely stand a chance with the Order's defense system," Kane said. For some reason, he thought twice about telling the commander about the drone tracking her ship. He figured it could wait until he met with someone higher up in the regime. Honestly, it may be the one piece of information that spares his life. A bargaining chip. The ship's console beeped softly, signaling that the ship had cleared the upper atmosphere. Mila adjusted the thrusters, the vibrations beneath her stabilizing as the scout ship broke into the open expanse of space. She stole a glance at the rear sensors, her stomach knotting at the lack of any blips trailing her path. No ships, no missiles, nothing. Her fingers tightened on the throttle, her jaw clenching as she punched in the final command to initiate the hyperspace jump. The stars outside the cockpit stretched and blurred, their sharp points smearing into radiant lines as the ship surged forward. Mila leaned back in her seat, exhaling slowly as the streaks of starlight engulfed her view. She wasn't safe yet, far from it, but the Syndicate couldn't follow her where she was going. Vidra Prime was more than just a destination. It was a sanctuary, a place where she could regroup, recalibrate, and uncover the truth buried in the data she carried. For now, the stars would carry her forward, each passing second pulling her further from the planet she'd fought so desperately to escape. Zephros was behind her,